Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Alright, before we begin, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we're traveling to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to explore a case that took nearly 18 years to solve, a story of deception, betrayal, and ultimately, justice delayed but not denied. This is the story of Shomari Taylor, a 38-year-old Philadelphia man whose life was cut short on a summer evening in 2006. What began as what appeared to be a routine traffic stop would evolve into one of the most elaborate and disturbing crimes in Philadelphia's history, a kidnapping orchestrated by men masquerading as police officers, leading to a murder that would remain unsolved for nearly 2 decades. Tonight, we'll walk through every detail of this complex case, from that fateful August evening in 2006, through the dark years of uncertainty, to the breakthrough that finally brought justice to Shomari's family in 2024. This is a story about the persistence of law enforcement, the advancement of investigative techniques, and the unbreakable bonds of family love. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me tell you about a case that proves that sometimes, justice takes time, but it does come. To understand the magnitude of this crime, we must first understand the man at its center. Shomari Taylor was born and raised in Philadelphia, the son of the late Pennsylvania State Representative John Myers. Growing up in a family deeply involved in public service and community leadership, Shomari was no stranger to the complexities of urban life. By 2006, at the age of 38, Shomari had built a life for himself in West Philadelphia. Those who knew him described him as a man who carried himself with quiet confidence, someone who understood the streets but also understood the importance of family and loyalty. Like many residents of Philadelphia's neighborhoods, Shomari navigated a world where legitimate opportunities often intersected with the underground economy. Shomari wasn't just a son of a politician, he was a father, a brother, and a friend to many in his community. His family connections meant that his disappearance wouldn't go unnoticed, but they also meant that the circumstances surrounding his vanishing would be scrutinized with particular intensity. In the summer of 2006, Shomari was involved in what federal investigators would later describe as drug-related activities. This wasn't uncommon in the neighborhoods where he lived and worked. The drug trade was an economic reality that touched many lives, sometimes by choice, sometimes by circumstance. What made Shomari's situation particularly dangerous was that he had accumulated both money and product that others coveted. The investigation would later reveal that Shomari's involvement in the drug trade had made him a target. Word had spread through certain circles that he possessed both cocaine and significant amounts of cash. In a world where such wealth could change hands through violence, Shomari Taylor had unknowingly painted a target on his back. But on the evening of August 26, 2006, as Shomari prepared to spend time with his girlfriend, he had no idea that a group of men had been watching him, planning, and preparing to take everything he had, including his life. August 26, 2006, was a warm Saturday evening in Philadelphia. The summer heat hung heavy in the air as residents sought relief in the cooler hours of the night. For Shomari Taylor, it was supposed to be a quiet evening with his 21-year-old girlfriend, whose name would later be protected by investigators to ensure her safety. The couple had decided to spend some time together in West Philadelphia, in the Overbrook neighborhood. They were sitting in a car, talking and enjoying each other's company, when their peaceful evening was shattered by the appearance of what seemed to be law enforcement officers. According to the girlfriend's later testimony, several men approached their vehicle. These men wore clothing that appeared to be police uniforms, and they carried themselves with the authority of law enforcement officers. They had badges, they spoke with the commanding tone of police, and they followed what appeared to be standard arrest procedures. The men informed Shomari and his girlfriend that they were under arrest. In a neighborhood where police presence was common and interactions with law enforcement were a regular part of life, neither Shomari nor his girlfriend had reason to question the legitimacy of these officers. They complied with the men's orders. What happened next would haunt the young woman for the rest of her life. She and Shomari were separated and taken to different vehicles. The men who had arrested them drove them through the streets of Philadelphia, eventually arriving at what appeared to be a warehouse or industrial building in a secluded area. It was only when they reached this location that the true nature of their situation became clear. These weren't police officers at all, they were kidnappers who had orchestrated an elaborate deception. The badges were fake, the uniforms were costumes, and the authority they projected was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. The girlfriend would later tell investigators that she was held for several hours in the warehouse. During this time, she could hear voices in other parts of the building, but she couldn't make out what was being said. The men who held her seemed focused on something else, someone else. That someone was Shomari. As the hours passed, the young woman began to understand that she was not the primary target of this operation. The men seemed less concerned with her and more focused on whatever was happening in the other part of the building. Then, as suddenly as the nightmare had begun, it took an unexpected turn. Several hours after their arrival at the warehouse, the men made a decision that would prove to be crucial to the eventual solving of this case. They released the girlfriend. They blindfolded her, drove her to a location several miles away, and left her on the street. They warned her not to contact police immediately and gave her explicit instructions about what she should and shouldn't say. The young woman, traumatized and confused, eventually made her way to safety and contacted authorities. But when police arrived at the location where she said the warehouse was, there was no sign of Shomari Taylor. He had vanished into the Philadelphia night, leaving behind only questions and a family desperate for answers. When Philadelphia police received the report of Shomari Taylor's kidnapping, they immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. The victim was the son of a state representative, the method of kidnapping was sophisticated and alarming, and the perpetrators had demonstrated a level of organization that suggested this wasn't a random crime. Detective units from multiple divisions were assigned to the case. The girlfriend's testimony provided crucial initial details, but it also raised more questions than it answered. The fake police officer angle was particularly concerning to law enforcement. It suggested that the perpetrators had inside knowledge of police procedures and had taken time to acquire convincing uniforms and badges. The initial investigation focused on several key areas. First, detectives worked to identify the warehouse where the victims had been taken. The girlfriend's description of the location and the route they had taken helped investigators narrow down possible locations, but the kidnappers had been careful to choose a secluded area that would be difficult to trace. Second, investigators began looking into Shomari's background and associates. While his family connections provided him with some protection from street-level violence, they also meant that his activities were more closely watched by both legitimate authorities and criminal elements. The investigation revealed that Shomari had been involved in drug trafficking and had accumulated significant assets that would make him an attractive target for robbery. Third, the sophisticated nature of the kidnapping suggested that this wasn't the work of street-level criminals acting impulsively. The fake police officer scheme required planning, resources, and coordination. This meant that multiple people were involved, and at least some of them had to have experience with law enforcement procedures. As weeks turned into months, the investigation expanded. Federal authorities became involved due to the kidnapping charges and the interstate nature of some of the evidence. The Drug Enforcement Administration contributed their expertise in drug-related crimes, while the FBI provided resources for the missing person investigation. One of the most challenging aspects of the case was the lack of physical evidence. The warehouse where the kidnapping had occurred was eventually located, but it had been cleaned thoroughly. The kidnappers had been methodical in their approach, leaving few traces of their presence. However, investigators did make one significant breakthrough in the early stages of the investigation. Through witness interviews and surveillance footage from the area, they were able to identify Kenneth Tuck as a person of interest in the case. Tuck had connections to the drug trade and had been seen in the vicinity of the kidnapping location around the time of the crime. In September 2006, just 1 month after Shomari's disappearance, Kenneth Tuck was arrested and charged in connection with the kidnapping. The arrest brought hope to the Taylor family and seemed to suggest that the case might be resolved quickly. But the criminal justice system, as we know, doesn't always work as efficiently as families hope. Kenneth Tuck's case would prove to be just the beginning of a long and frustrating journey through the courts. Kenneth Tuck's arrest in September 2006 marked what many hoped would be the beginning of the end of the Shomari Taylor case. The Philadelphia District Attorney's Office believed they had sufficient evidence to secure a conviction, and the case proceeded to trial. However, the prosecution faced significant challenges from the start. The primary witness was Shomari's girlfriend, who had been traumatized by her experience and whose testimony, while crucial, was limited by the conditions of her captivity. She had been blindfolded for much of the time and had not witnessed the actual murder of Shomari Taylor. The physical evidence was minimal. The warehouse had been cleaned, and the kidnappers had been careful to avoid leaving fingerprints or DNA evidence. The case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony, which made it vulnerable to challenges from a skilled defense attorney. Kenneth Tuck's first trial ended in a hung jury. The jurors couldn't reach a unanimous decision about his guilt, and the case was declared a mistrial. This was a devastating blow to the prosecution and to Shomari's family, who had hoped for quick justice. The district attorney's office decided to retry the case, believing that they could present their evidence more effectively in a second trial. However, the second trial proved to be even more challenging than the first. Defense attorneys had had time to prepare more thoroughly, and they were able to cast doubt on key elements of the prosecution's case. In the end, Kenneth Tuck was acquitted of all charges related to Shomari Taylor's kidnapping and presumed murder. The acquittal was a crushing blow to the investigation and to the Taylor family's hopes for justice. But the acquittal didn't mean that investigators believed Tuck was innocent. Many of the detectives and prosecutors involved in the case remained convinced that Tuck was involved in the crime, but they also recognized that their case had been insufficient to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The failed prosecutions had several important consequences for the ongoing investigation. First, they demonstrated that the case was more complex than initially believed and that additional evidence would be needed to secure convictions. Second, they provided valuable insights into the defense strategies that would likely be employed in future prosecutions. Third, they highlighted the need for physical evidence to corroborate witness testimony. Most importantly, the failed prosecutions didn't end the investigation. While the case might have gone cold in terms of active prosecution, it remained open, and investigators continued to work on developing new leads and evidence. During this period, the Taylor family endured unimaginable pain. Not only had they lost Shomari, but they had also watched the criminal justice system fail to deliver justice. The acquittals meant that the people responsible for Shomari's disappearance and presumed death were still free, still living in the same community, still potentially dangerous to others. For John Myers, Shomari's father and a respected political figure, the failure of the justice system was particularly painful. As a state representative, he had worked to strengthen laws and support law enforcement, but when his own family needed justice, the system had let them down. The years following the acquittals were dark ones for the Taylor family. They continued to hope that Shomari might somehow still be alive, but as time passed, that hope became increasingly difficult to maintain. Without a body, however, there could be no closure, no funeral, no final goodbye. After Kenneth Tuck's acquittal, the Shomari Taylor case officially became a cold case. This didn't mean that investigators had given up. It meant that they had exhausted their immediate leads and would need to wait for new evidence or witnesses to come forward. Cold cases are some of the most challenging aspects of police work. Detectives must balance the need to continue investigating unsolved crimes with the demands of new cases that require immediate attention. For the officers who had worked on the Taylor case, the unsolved murder was a constant reminder of the limitations of their profession. During the cold case years, several developments kept the investigation alive. New detectives were assigned to review the case files, bringing fresh perspectives to the evidence. Advances in forensic technology offered new possibilities for analyzing existing evidence. And most importantly, the involvement of federal authorities meant that the case had resources and expertise that might not have been available to local police. The FBI's involvement in the case was particularly significant. Federal agents brought different investigative techniques and access to resources that could help crack the case. They also had the ability to pursue federal charges, which carried more severe penalties than state charges and might provide additional leverage in securing cooperation from witnesses. One of the most important aspects of the federal investigation was the focus on the conspiracy aspects of the crime. The elaborate nature of the fake police officer scheme suggested that multiple people had been involved in planning and executing the kidnapping. Federal conspiracy charges could potentially be used to pressure lower-level participants to provide information about the leaders of the operation. During this period, investigators also worked to build a more complete picture of the criminal network that had been involved in the kidnapping. The drug trade connections meant that there were likely other crimes connected to the same group of perpetrators. By investigating these related crimes, agents hoped to find evidence that could be used in the Taylor case. The cold case years were also marked by advances in DNA technology and forensic science. Techniques that hadn't been available in 2006 were becoming standard tools for investigators. Cold case units across the country were reopening old files and subjecting evidence to new types of analysis. For the Taylor family, the cold case years were a period of sustained grief and uncertainty. Without a body, they couldn't hold a proper funeral or find closure. The acquittals had left them without justice, and the passage of time was making it seem increasingly unlikely that they would ever get answers. John Myers, Shomara's father, continued to use his political connections to keep pressure on law enforcement agencies to continue investigating the case. He met regularly with police officials and federal agents, reminding them that his son's case remained unsolved and that his family was still waiting for justice. The cold case years also saw changes in the law enforcement landscape that would eventually prove crucial to solving the case. New task forces were created to focus specifically on cold cases. Federal funding was allocated to support advanced forensic techniques. And most importantly, a new generation of investigators was trained in techniques that would prove essential to cracking old cases. As the 10th anniversary of Shomara's disappearance approached in 2016, his family held a memorial service. They still didn't know what had happened to him, but they wanted to ensure that he wasn't forgotten. The memorial service was attended by community members, law enforcement officials, and political figures who wanted to show their support for the family and their commitment to finding justice. The memorial service also served another purpose. It reminded the community that the case remained unsolved and that information was still being sought. Sometimes, the passage of time can loosen tongues. People who were afraid to speak out immediately after a crime might be more willing to come forward years later, especially if circumstances in their own lives have changed. 12 years after Shomara Taylor's disappearance, investigators received the break they had been waiting for. On August 21, 2018, construction workers in North Philadelphia made a grim discovery that would reinvigorate the entire investigation. The workers were excavating a vacant lot in the 2700 block of North 16th Street when they uncovered what appeared to be human remains. The bones were found in a shallow grave that had been carefully concealed but not deep enough to prevent eventual discovery. The Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office was immediately contacted, and the remains were carefully extracted from the site. The location was secured as a crime scene, and investigators began the painstaking process of examining the area for additional evidence. The forensic examination of the remains would take several weeks, but investigators were cautiously optimistic that they had finally found Shomara Taylor. The location of the grave was consistent with the geographical area where the kidnappers had been active, and the timeline seemed to match the period when Shomara had disappeared. DNA analysis confirmed what investigators had hoped and the Taylor family had feared. The remains were indeed those of Shomara Taylor. After 12 years of uncertainty, the family finally had confirmation of what they had long suspected. Shomara had been murdered shortly after his kidnapping in August 2006. The discovery of Shomara's remains was both a relief and a renewed source of pain for his family. On one hand, they finally had closure about his fate and could proceed with burial arrangements. On the other hand, the confirmation of his death meant letting go of any lingering hope that he might somehow still be alive. For investigators, the discovery of the body was a game-changer. Now they had a crime scene to examine, physical evidence to analyze, and most importantly, they could pursue murder charges against the perpetrators. The case was no longer just a kidnapping, it was a homicide, and that carried much more serious penalties. The forensic examination of Shamare's remains and the burial site provided crucial new evidence. The medical examiner was able to determine the cause of death, which investigators kept confidential but which provided important clues about how the murder had been carried out. The burial site was carefully examined for any evidence that might have been left by the killers. The discovery also allowed investigators to create a more complete timeline of the crime. They could now determine approximately when Shamare had been killed and how long his body had been in the grave. This information helped them focus their investigation on the activities of suspects during the critical period after the kidnapping. Most importantly, the discovery of the body reinvigorated the entire investigation. Detectives who had been working on the cold case were joined by additional investigators. Federal agents renewed their focus on the case. And new forensic techniques were applied to both the old evidence and the new evidence from the burial site. The renewed investigation also benefited from advances in technology and investigative techniques that hadn't been available in 2006. Cell phone records could be analyzed more thoroughly. Financial records could be traced more effectively. And social media and other digital footprints could provide new insights into the relationships and activities of suspects. For the community, the discovery of Shamare's remains was a reminder that justice, while delayed, might still be possible. The case had never been forgotten, but the discovery of the body brought it back into the public consciousness and reminded everyone that the perpetrators had never been held accountable. The Taylor family held a funeral for Shamare in September 2018, more than 12 years after his death. The service was attended by hundreds of community members, law enforcement officials, and political figures. It was both a celebration of Shamare's life and a renewed call for justice. With Shamare Taylor's remains finally recovered and the case officially classified as a homicide, federal and local investigators launched what would become the final phase of their investigation. This time, they had advantages they hadn't possessed in 2006, advanced forensic technology, a complete understanding of the crime scene, and nearly 2 decades of accumulated evidence and witness statements. The investigation was now being led by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, working in conjunction with the FBI, the Philadelphia Police Department, and the Drug Enforcement Administration. This multi-agency approach brought together expertise from different areas of law enforcement and ensured that the case would receive the resources it deserved. One of the first steps in the renewed investigation was a complete review of all existing evidence. Investigators went through thousands of pages of reports, witness statements, and forensic analysis from the original investigation. They also began applying new forensic techniques to evidence that had been collected years earlier. The breakthrough came through a combination of traditional detective work and modern investigative techniques. Investigators had never stopped monitoring the activities of their original suspects, and over the years, they had gathered additional information about their criminal activities and associations. Cell phone records from 2006, which had been partially analyzed during the original investigation, were subjected to more sophisticated analysis techniques. Financial records were examined more thoroughly, revealing patterns of money movement that correlated with the timeline of the kidnapping and murder. And investigators were able to trace relationships and communications between suspects that hadn't been apparent in the original investigation. The investigation also benefited from changes in the criminal landscape. Some of the original suspects had been arrested for other crimes over the years, and their legal troubles made them more vulnerable to pressure from federal investigators. People who had been unwilling to cooperate in 2006 were now facing their own legal problems and were more inclined to provide information in exchange for consideration. One of the most significant developments was the decision to pursue federal charges rather than relying solely on state charges. Federal conspiracy and drug-related charges carried much more severe penalties than state charges, and they also provided investigators with additional tools for building their case. The federal approach also allowed investigators to focus on the conspiracy aspects of the crime. The elaborate fake police officer scheme had required planning, coordination, and the involvement of multiple people. Federal conspiracy laws made it possible to charge all of the participants, even those who hadn't directly participated in the kidnapping or murder. By early 2024, investigators had built what they believed was a comprehensive case against the people responsible for Shamari Taylor's kidnapping and murder. The evidence included witness testimony, forensic evidence from the burial site, financial records, cell phone data, and testimony from cooperating witnesses who had finally agreed to provide information about the crime. The investigation had identified at least 9 people who had been involved in the conspiracy to kidnap and murder Shamari Taylor. Some had been planners and organizers, others had been directly involved in the kidnapping and murder, and still others had provided support or assistance after the fact. The case that investigators had built was dramatically different from the one that had failed to convict Kenneth Tuck in 2006. This time, they had physical evidence, multiple witnesses, and a complete understanding of the conspiracy that had led to Shamari's death. On May 2, 2024, nearly 18 years after Shamari Taylor's kidnapping and murder, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania announced that 5 men had been charged in connection with the crime. The announcement marked the culmination of one of the longest-running investigations in Philadelphia's history. The 5 men charged were Kevin Holloway, Mark Scott, Linton Mathis, Adaba Wicker, and Kenneth Tuck. Yes, Kenneth Tuck, the same man who had been acquitted of state charges in 2006, was now facing federal charges for the same crime. The principle of double jeopardy didn't apply because these were federal charges, not state charges, and they were based on different legal theories and evidence. According to the federal indictment, the 5 men had conspired to rob Shamari Taylor of cocaine and drug proceeds. The conspiracy had involved at least 9 people total, though only 5 were charged in the initial indictment. The elaborate fake police officer scheme had been designed to make the kidnapping appear legitimate and to prevent Shamari and his girlfriend from resisting or trying to escape. The indictment revealed disturbing details about the crime that hadn't been public before. After kidnapping Shamari and his girlfriend, the conspirators had taken them to a warehouse in North Philadelphia. The girlfriend had been released after several hours, but Shamari had been tortured and ultimately suffocated to death. The motive for the crime was robbery, but the execution had been far more elaborate and brutal than a typical drug robbery. The fake police officer scheme had required significant planning and resources. The torture and murder had been carried out over several hours. And the disposal of the body had been carefully planned to avoid detection. The charges against the 5 men included conspiracy to commit Hobbs Act robbery, conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, and murder in connection with drug trafficking. If convicted, all 5 men faced the possibility of life in prison. The announcement of the charges was made at a press conference attended by federal prosecutors, FBI officials, Philadelphia Police Commissioner Kevin Bethel, and members of the Taylor family. For Shamari's family, the announcement was the moment they had been waiting for since 2006. U.S. Attorney Jacqueline Romero emphasized the persistence of the investigators who had never given up on the case. She noted that the charges were the result of years of tireless work by federal agents, local police, and prosecutors who had refused to let the case go cold. Philadelphia Police Commissioner Kevin Bethel praised the collaborative effort between different law enforcement agencies and emphasized that the nature of the crime, with its elaborate planning, impersonation of law enforcement, and brutal execution, had made it a priority for all involved agencies. For the Taylor family, the announcement was both a vindication and a source of renewed grief. John Myers, Shamari's father, had died in 2014 without seeing justice for his son. But other family members were present to witness the announcement and to know that the people responsible for Shamari's death would finally face justice. The cases against the 5 defendants would proceed through the federal court system, with each defendant facing the possibility of a lengthy trial and life imprisonment if convicted. The federal charges were based on much stronger evidence than the state charges that had failed in 2006, and prosecutors expressed confidence in their ability to secure convictions. As we conclude this long journey through the Shomari Taylor case, it's worth reflecting on what this story tells us about crime, justice, and the human capacity for both evil and perseverance. The Shomari Taylor case demonstrates the complexity of modern criminal investigations. What appeared to be a straightforward kidnapping in 2006 turned out to be an elaborate conspiracy involving multiple perpetrators, sophisticated planning, and brutal execution. The fake police officer scheme was particularly disturbing because it exploited the public's trust in law enforcement and made the victims more vulnerable to their attackers. The case also illustrates the evolution of investigative techniques over the past 2 decades. Evidence that couldn't be fully analyzed in 2006 became crucial to solving the case in 2024. Cell phone records, financial data, and forensic evidence were all subjected to more sophisticated analysis techniques that weren't available 18 years ago. Perhaps most importantly, the case demonstrates the importance of persistence in criminal investigations. The failure of the initial prosecutions in 2006 could have marked the end of the case, but investigators refused to give up. They continued to work on the case even when it seemed hopeless, and they were ultimately rewarded with a breakthrough that led to charges against the perpetrators. The discovery of Shomari's remains in 2018 was the turning point that made justice possible. Without the body, investigators lacked the physical evidence necessary to build a strong case. The discovery of the shallow grave provided not only confirmation of Shomari's death but also crucial forensic evidence that helped identify his killers. The case also highlights the impact of unsolved crimes on families and communities. For 18 years, the Taylor family lived with uncertainty about Shomari's fate and frustration with the justice system's inability to hold his killers accountable. The eventual charges brought some measure of closure, but they couldn't restore the years of pain and uncertainty that the family had endured. For the community, the Shomari Taylor case served as a reminder that violence has consequences that extend far beyond the immediate victims. The elaborate nature of the crime and the fact that it remained unsolved for so long created fear and distrust that affected the entire neighborhood. As this case moves forward through the federal court system, it will continue to provide lessons about justice, persistence, and the importance of never giving up on victims and their families. The charges announced in May 2024 marked not the end of the story, but the beginning of the final chapter in a long quest for justice. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember Shomari Taylor, a son, a father, a member of a community who deserved better than the violence that took his life. Remember also the investigators who never gave up, the family members who never stopped seeking justice, and the truth that sometimes emerges even after many years in darkness. The case of Shomari Taylor reminds us that justice may be delayed, but it need not be denied. In a world where so many crimes go unsolved and so many families never get answers, this case stands as a testament to the power of persistence, the advancement of investigative techniques, and the unbreakable bonds of family love. Tonight, I want you to know that investigators are still working on cold cases, still seeking justice for victims and their families, still refusing to give up even when the odds seem impossible. The story of Shomari Taylor is their story too, a story of dedication, perseverance, and the belief that everyone deserves justice, no matter how long it takes. Please, if you're new here, welcome to our channel where we explore true crime stories in a calm, respectful manner. Also, I want to use this opportunity to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Please, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 2. Tonight, we journey to the serene shores of Lake Monticello, Virginia, where beneath the calm waters and peaceful suburban streets, a story of love, obsession, and ultimate tragedy unfolded. This is the story of Taylor Lindsay Harsh, a young woman whose life was cut tragically short at just 23 years old. Her story is not just one of murder, but of the insidious nature of controlling relationships, the warning signs that too often go unheeded, and the devastating consequences when love becomes possession. As we settle into this tale, let the gentle rhythm of the narrative wash over you. We'll explore the quiet neighborhoods of Central Virginia, the complex dynamics of a troubled relationship, and the events that led to a September morning in 2015 that would forever change the lives of everyone who knew Taylor Harsh. Our story begins approximately 10 years before that fateful September morning in 2015. Picture, if you will, a small Virginia community where everyone knows everyone, where summer evenings stretch long and peaceful, and where a 14-year-old girl named Taylor Harsh was just beginning to discover who she was meant to become. Taylor was the kind of girl who lit up rooms without trying. She had that particular energy that some young people possess, bright, optimistic, full of dreams for the future. At 14, she was navigating the typical challenges of high school, friendships, and that awkward space between childhood and adulthood that we all remember so vividly. It was during this vulnerable time in her life that Taylor encountered Franklin Lee Burris. Franklin was not a classmate, not someone from her peer group navigating the same teenage uncertainties. Franklin was 25 years old, 11 years her senior, already an adult with adult experiences, while Taylor was still figuring out her place in the world. The circumstances of their first meeting remain somewhat unclear, lost now in the tragedy that would follow. What we do know is that Franklin, a man who should have seen a child when he looked at 14-year-old Taylor, instead saw something else entirely. Perhaps he saw someone he could shape, someone he could control, someone who would look up to him with the natural deference that age and experience often command. This age gap, 11 years, might not seem significant between, say, a 30-year-old and a 41-year-old. But between a 14-year-old and a 25-year-old, it represents entirely different stages of human development. Taylor was learning to drive, worried about homework and high school drama. Franklin was old enough to have been working for years, to have lived independently, to have formed his adult identity. The relationship that began to develop between them was, from its very inception, built on an inherent imbalance of power. Franklin possessed all the advantages: age, experience, financial independence, the confidence that comes with being an adult in the world. Taylor had youth, vulnerability, and that natural tendency of teenagers to idealize older figures who show them attention. As their relationship developed over the months and years that followed, patterns began to emerge. Those who knew them described Franklin as intensely controlling. This wasn't the healthy protectiveness that might develop between two people who care for each other. This was something darker, more possessive. Control in relationships often begins subtly. It might start with someone wanting to know where you are at all times, not out of care, but out of a need to monitor and direct your movements. It might manifest as criticism dressed up as concern, comments about your appearance, your friends, your decisions that slowly erode your confidence in your own judgment. For Taylor, who had entered this relationship as a child, these controlling behaviors became normalized. When you're 14 and a 25-year-old man pays attention to you, it can feel flattering, special. You might not recognize the red flags because you haven't yet developed the life experience to know what healthy relationships look like. As Taylor moved through her teenage years, her relationship with Franklin became increasingly central to her identity. Friends and family began to notice changes in her behavior, the way she might check her phone constantly, the way she seemed to need Franklin's approval for decisions both large and small. The relationship was turbulent from the beginning. They would break up, sometimes for weeks or months at a time, only to reconcile again. Each breakup might have seemed like an opportunity for Taylor to reclaim her independence, to rediscover who she was outside of Franklin's influence. But each reconciliation drew her back into the same patterns, the same cycles of control and dependency. During their off periods, Taylor would begin to flourish. Friends would see glimpses of the bright, independent young woman she was meant to be. But inevitably, Franklin would reappear, and the cycle would begin again. This pattern, the breaking up and getting back together, is common in controlling relationships. It serves multiple purposes for the controlling partner. It prevents the other person from ever fully moving on, keeps them emotionally available and invested. It also reinforces the idea that the relationship, despite its problems, is somehow special, worth fighting for, irreplaceable. For Taylor, these cycles meant that her formative years, the time when most young people are learning independence, forming their own identities, making their own mistakes and learning from them, were instead spent navigating the demands and expectations of a much older man who saw her not as an individual to be supported and encouraged, but as someone to be molded and controlled. As Taylor transitioned from teenager to young adult, the patterns that had been established in her relationship with Franklin only deepened and intensified. What had begun as an inappropriate relationship between a man and a child had evolved into something even more troubling, a bond that seemed designed to prevent Taylor from ever truly growing into her own person. By the time Taylor reached her early 20s, she had spent nearly half her life under Franklin's influence. Think about that for a moment. From the age when she was just beginning to form her own opinions and preferences, she had been in a relationship with someone who sought to direct and control those very processes of self-discovery. The controlling behavior that characterized their relationship manifested in numerous ways. Franklin reportedly monitored Taylor's activities closely, wanting to know where she was, who she was with, what she was doing at all times. This wasn't the natural curiosity of a caring partner, but the invasive surveillance of someone who viewed their partner as property to be monitored and managed. There were reports of Franklin being intensely jealous, not just of other romantic interests, but of Taylor's friendships, her family relationships, any connection that might compete for her attention or loyalty. This kind of jealousy often isolates the victim, gradually cutting them off from their support network until the controlling partner becomes their primary, and sometimes only, significant relationship. Physical violence was also part of their dynamic. While the specific details of these incidents remain largely private, those familiar with the case have indicated that their relationship, at times, turned physically violent. This physical aggression, combined with the emotional and psychological control, created an environment where Taylor's safety and well-being were constantly under threat. One of the most insidious aspects of controlling relationships is how they reshape the victim's understanding of normal behavior. When you've been in such a relationship for years, especially one that began when you were very young, the controlling behaviors begin to seem natural, even caring. The constant monitoring might be reframed as protectiveness. The jealousy might be interpreted as proof of love. The isolation from others might feel like romantic exclusivity. Taylor's friends and family undoubtedly noticed these patterns, but intervening in such situations is incredibly difficult. When someone is deep in a controlling relationship, attempts by others to point out the problematic behavior are often met with defensiveness. The victim might feel they need to protect their partner, or they might have been conditioned to believe that others just don't understand their special relationship. Throughout this period, Taylor was trying to build a life for herself. She was working, pursuing her own interests, attempting to establish some degree of independence. But Franklin's presence in her life made true independence nearly impossible. Even during their separations, his influence lingered, the threat of his return, the emotional baggage from their shared history, the way years of control had shaped her decision-making processes. The on-again, off-again nature of their relationship during these years created a particularly painful dynamic. Each separation might have offered hope for a fresh start, a chance for Taylor to rediscover herself outside of Franklin's shadow. Each reconciliation not only dashed those hopes but reinforced the message that she couldn't truly escape, that their connection was somehow inevitable. During their periods apart, Franklin would reportedly move out of wherever they had been living together, only to return when they reconciled. This pattern of leaving and returning gave him tremendous power over Taylor's living situation, her sense of stability, her ability to plan for the future. It's difficult to build an independent life when you never know if the most disruptive force in your world is going to suddenly reappear. For Taylor, these years represented a slow erosion of her agency and autonomy. The bright, promising young woman she had been at 14 was gradually being subsumed by the demands of a relationship that required her to be smaller, more dependent, more controllable. Every decision had to be weighed against Franklin's likely reaction. Every friendship had to be evaluated for his approval. Every aspect of her life became filtered through the lens of his needs and expectations. The psychological impact of living this way for years cannot be overstated. When your entire adult life has been shaped by someone else's control, when your sense of self has been so thoroughly entangled with another person's demands, it becomes incredibly difficult to imagine any other way of existing. The relationship becomes not just a part of your life, but the organizing principle around which everything else revolves. This was the context in which Taylor and Franklin's relationship continued to evolve. Not as a partnership between equals, but as a dynamic of control and submission that had been established when she was still a child and had only intensified as she became an adult. The stage was being set for the tragic events that would ultimately unfold, though at the time, neither the severity of the danger nor the inevitability of the outcome was yet clear to those who loved Taylor and wanted to see her break free from this destructive pattern. In 2014, after nearly a decade of their tumultuous on-again, off-again relationship, Taylor Harsh and Franklin Burris made the decision to marry. To outsiders, this might have seemed like a natural progression, two people who had been together, in various forms, for so many years finally deciding to make their commitment official. But for those who understood the true nature of their relationship, this marriage represented something far more troubling. It wasn't the celebration of a loving partnership between equals, but rather the legal formalization of a relationship built on control, dependency, and an imbalance of power that had existed since Taylor was a child. Marriage, in many ways, can serve to further entrench controlling dynamics. The legal and social bonds of marriage can make it even more difficult for someone in an abusive relationship to leave. There's often increased social pressure to make it work, to honor the commitment made before family and friends. There are legal complications around divorce, shared assets, shared living arrangements. The very permanence that makes marriage meaningful for healthy couples can become a trap for those in destructive relationships. For Taylor, now in her early 20s, this marriage might have represented hope that the legal commitment would somehow transform their relationship, that Franklin's controlling behavior would improve with the security of marriage, that the constant cycle of breaking up and reconciling would finally end. Many people in controlling relationships cling to such hopes, believing that the next milestone, moving in together, getting engaged, getting married, having children, will be the thing that finally fixes the fundamental problems in their relationship. But controlling behavior doesn't disappear with marriage. If anything, it often intensifies. The legal bonds of marriage can make the controlling partner feel even more entitled to monitor, direct, and restrict their spouse's behavior. The social recognition of the relationship can validate their sense of ownership over their partner. Franklin's behavior after marriage followed this predictable pattern. Rather than stabilizing their relationship, marriage seemed to provide him with even more justification for his controlling behavior. He was no longer just Taylor's boyfriend or partner, he was her husband, with all the traditional expectations of authority and control that he might associate with that role. The couple established their married life in Lake Monticello, Virginia, a quiet community built around a man-made lake in Fluvanna County. Lake Monticello is the kind of place where people go to find peace, to escape the hustle and bustle of larger cities, to build quiet, stable lives. The community is close-knit, the kind of place where neighbors know each other, where the pace of life is slower and more deliberate. In many ways, it should have been an ideal setting for a young couple starting their married life together. The lakeside setting offered natural beauty and recreational opportunities. The community was safe and welcoming. There were opportunities for both work and leisure, space to build the kind of life that many young couples dream of. But the external setting, no matter how peaceful and idyllic, couldn't change the fundamental dynamics of Taylor and Franklin's relationship. The same patterns that had characterized their decade-long courtship continued into their marriage. Franklin's controlling behavior persisted. The jealousy, the monitoring, the attempts to isolate Taylor from others, none of these behaviors were magically resolved by the act of marriage. In fact, living together as husband and wife may have made these behaviors more intense and more constant. When you're dating someone, even someone controlling, there are still moments of separation, times when you're in your own space, with your own thoughts, making your own decisions. But living together, especially in a relationship where one partner seeks to control the other, can mean that the monitoring and control become a 24-hour reality. Taylor, now Taylor Burris, was trying to build a life as a married woman while still dealing with all the same fundamental problems that had plagued their relationship from the beginning. The legal status might have changed, but the emotional and psychological dynamics remained the same. She was still the same person who had been molded by years of control, still trapped in patterns of dependency and submission that had been established when she was too young to recognize them for what they were. Their first year of marriage was marked by continued instability. The same cycle of conflict and temporary reconciliation that had characterized their dating relationship continued. Franklin would reportedly move in and out of their Lake Monticello home multiple times, creating an environment of constant uncertainty and instability. This pattern of leaving and returning, which had been disruptive during their dating years, became even more problematic now that they were married and supposedly building a stable home together. Taylor never knew whether she would come home to find Franklin there or gone, whether their next argument would result in another temporary separation, whether the life they were supposedly building together had any real foundation. The community around Lake Monticello began to notice the dysfunction in the Burris household. In a close-knit community, domestic problems are often visible to neighbors and friends. There might have been loud arguments, police calls, signs of physical altercations. The very privacy and isolation that make communities like Lake Monticello attractive can also make them dangerous for someone trapped in an abusive relationship: fewer witnesses, fewer opportunities for intervention, more space for dangerous behavior to escalate without outside interference. As their first year of marriage progressed, it became increasingly clear that the legal formalization of their relationship had not resolved any of the fundamental problems that had existed from the beginning. If anything, the intensity and frequency of their conflicts seemed to be increasing. The patterns of control and resistance, of Franklin's attempts to dominate and Taylor's efforts to maintain some sense of self, were becoming more pronounced and more dangerous. As we move deeper into 2015, the year that would prove to be Taylor's last, the dynamics in the Burris household were becoming increasingly unstable and dangerous. The patterns of control that had characterized their relationship for over a decade were intensifying, and the consequences of their conflicts were becoming more severe. Franklin's behavior during this period showed all the classic signs of an abuser whose control is beginning to slip. When someone who has built their identity around controlling another person begins to sense that their control is weakening, their behavior often becomes more desperate and more dangerous. They may escalate their controlling tactics, becoming more physically aggressive, more emotionally manipulative, more desperate to reassert their dominance. For Taylor, now 23 years old, this may have been a period when she was beginning to truly understand the nature of her relationship and consider what it might mean to break free permanently. After nearly a decade under Franklin's influence, she may have been starting to develop the emotional maturity and life experience necessary to recognize that their relationship was not just troubled, but fundamentally unhealthy and dangerous. This kind of awakening is common in long-term abusive relationships, particularly those that began when the victim was very young. As the victim matures and gains life experience, they may begin to see their relationship more clearly, to understand that the behaviors they've normalized are actually abusive, to envision what life might look like outside the relationship. But this period of awakening is also when the relationship becomes most dangerous. An abuser who senses that their victim is beginning to pull away, to question the relationship, to consider leaving, often becomes more violent and more desperate to maintain control. They may escalate their tactics, believing that if they can just reassert their dominance forcefully enough, they can return to the previous dynamic. The constant cycle of Franklin moving in and out of their Lake Monticello home during this period suggests that their conflicts were becoming more frequent and more intense. Each time he left, it might have offered Taylor a glimpse of what life could be like without his constant presence and control. Each time he returned, it reinforced the message that she couldn't truly escape, that he would always be a part of her life whether she wanted him there or not. This pattern of leaving and returning is particularly psychologically damaging because it prevents the victim from ever fully moving on or healing. Just when they might begin to regain their sense of self and independence, the abusive partner returns, often with promises of change, apologies for past behavior, or threats about what will happen if the victim doesn't take them back. During their separations, Taylor may have begun to reconnect with friends and family members from whom she had been isolated during the periods when Franklin was most controlling. She may have started making independent decisions about her daily life, her work, her future plans. She may have begun to remember who she was outside of the relationship that had defined her for so long. But each reconciliation would disrupt this process of recovery and self-discovery. Franklin's return would bring with it all the old patterns of control and manipulation. The progress Taylor had made toward independence would be undermined, and she would find herself back in the same familiar dynamic of submission and control. The physical violence that had been part of their relationship from earlier years may have been escalating during this period. When other methods of control begin to fail, abusers often turn to increased physical aggression as a way of reasserting their dominance. The violence may become more frequent, more severe, or more unpredictable. For someone like Taylor, who had been in this relationship for so long, the escalating violence may have been terrifying but not entirely surprising. She had learned to read Franklin's moods, to anticipate his reactions, to modify her behavior in attempts to avoid triggering his anger. But in a relationship where the violence is escalating, these survival strategies become less and less effective. The community around Lake Monticello may have become increasingly aware that something was wrong in the Burris household. Neighbors might have heard arguments, witnessed Franklin's arrivals and departures, noticed signs of distress or injury on Taylor. But intervening in domestic violence situations is complicated, especially in close-knit communities where everyone knows everyone and the social dynamics are complex. Friends and family members who cared about Taylor may have been trying to help her see the danger she was in, to encourage her to leave permanently, to offer her support and resources for breaking free from the relationship. But for someone who has been controlled for so long, especially since such a young age, accepting help and making the decision to leave can be incredibly difficult. There are many practical barriers to leaving an abusive relationship: financial dependence, shared housing, legal complications from marriage, fear of retaliation. But there are also psychological barriers that can be even more challenging to overcome. After years of being told that you're incapable of making good decisions on your own, that you need your partner's guidance and control, that you're somehow responsible for the problems in the relationship, it can be nearly impossible to trust your own judgment enough to take the dramatic step of leaving permanently. As the summer of 2015 progressed toward fall, the situation in the Burris household was becoming increasingly volatile and dangerous. The patterns that had been established over more than a decade were reaching a breaking point. Neither Taylor nor Franklin could continue living in the constant cycle of conflict, separation, and reconciliation indefinitely. Something was going to have to give. Unfortunately, in relationships characterized by this level of control and violence, when something finally gives, the results are often tragic. The most dangerous time for someone in an abusive relationship is often when they are trying to leave or when the abuser perceives that they are losing control permanently. It is during these moments of transition and desperation that domestic violence situations most often turn deadly. September 5, 2015, began like many other days in the quiet community of Lake Monticello. The late summer air was still warm, the kind of evening when families might have been preparing for barbecues or children might have been squeezing the last drops of freedom from their summer vacation before school fully resumed. The lake itself would have been peaceful, reflecting the setting sun and the gradually cooling sky. Inside the Burris home, however, the atmosphere was far from peaceful. The tensions that had been building for months, perhaps years, were reaching a critical point. The exact details of what transpired in those final hours remain known only to Franklin, but we can piece together the general outline of events from the court proceedings and official statements that followed. What we know is that in the early morning hours of September 5, sometime before 4 a.m., Taylor Lindsay Burris's life came to a violent end at the hands of her husband, Franklin Lee Burris. The young woman who had endured nearly a decade of control and abuse, who had somehow survived the escalating violence and psychological manipulation, who may have been finally finding the strength to break free permanently, was killed in her own home by the man who claimed to love her. The call to emergency services came in just before 4 a.m. Picture, if you will, the quiet streets of Lake Monticello in those pre-dawn hours. Most residents would have been sleeping peacefully, unaware that just a few houses away, a tragedy of enormous proportions was unfolding. The dispatcher who took that call could not have known that they were about to become part of a story that would shake the small community to its core. The details of that phone call, who made it and what was said, remain part of the official record that emerged during the legal proceedings. What matters for our understanding of this tragedy is that by the time emergency responders arrived at the Burris home, it was already too late to save Taylor. The first responders who arrived at the scene encountered what can only be described as a horrific situation. Taylor's body bore the evidence of extreme violence. The medical examiner would later determine the specific cause of death, but it was clear that she had suffered tremendously in her final moments. The young woman who had once been full of life and promise, who had survived years of abuse and control, had finally been silenced forever. Franklin was still at the scene when police arrived. He was immediately taken into custody and charged with first-degree murder. The man who had controlled Taylor's life for nearly half of her existence, who had shaped her from a child into a woman who lived in constant fear of his anger, had finally taken the ultimate step in asserting his dominance over her. As dawn broke over Lake Monticello on September 5, 2015, the community began to learn about the tragedy that had occurred in their midst. Neighbors who had known the couple, who had perhaps suspected that their relationship was troubled, were confronted with the reality that the woman they had seen around the neighborhood, at local businesses, living what might have seemed like an ordinary life, had been murdered by her own husband. The news rippled through the tight-knit community like a stone thrown into still water. In places like Lake Monticello, violent crime is relatively rare, and domestic murder is almost unthinkable. The residents who had chosen to live in this peaceful lakeside community suddenly found themselves confronting the reality that such terrible violence could happen anywhere, even in their safe haven. For Taylor's family and friends, the news would have been devastating beyond measure. The young woman they had loved, worried about, and tried to help was gone. All their fears about her relationship with Franklin, all their concerns about his controlling behavior and the violence they may have witnessed or suspected, had been tragically validated. The worst-case scenario they may have worried about in quiet moments had become reality. The investigation that followed would reveal the full extent of what had happened in the Burris home that night. Detectives would piece together the physical evidence, the timeline of events, the pattern of behavior that had led to this tragic conclusion. But for those who had known Taylor, no amount of official investigation could bring back the vibrant young woman whose life had been cut so brutally short. Franklin's arrest marked the beginning of a legal process that would continue for years. He was charged with first-degree murder, indicating that prosecutors believed the killing had been premeditated, planned in advance rather than committed in a sudden burst of anger. This charge suggested that the violence of September 5 was not an aberration, but the logical endpoint of a relationship built on control and the threat of violence. As Franklin was led away in handcuffs, the full weight of what had happened began to settle over everyone who had known the couple. The controlling behaviors that friends and family had worried about, the cycle of violence and reconciliation that had characterized their relationship, the escalating danger that had been building for months, all of these warning signs had culminated in the worst possible outcome. The Lake Monticello community, shaken by the violence that had occurred in their midst, began the difficult process of trying to understand how such a tragedy could have happened. They would grapple with questions that communities across the country face when domestic violence turns deadly. Were there signs they should have recognized? Could they have done something to prevent this tragedy? How do you identify when a troubled relationship has become a deadly threat? In the days and weeks following Taylor's murder, the community of Lake Monticello struggled to come to terms with the tragedy that had occurred in their midst. The Fluvanna County Sheriff's Office, led by Sheriff Eric Hess, worked to piece together the details of what had happened in the Burris home that morning. The investigation would reveal the full extent of the violence that had ended Taylor's life and provide the evidence necessary to hold Franklin accountable for his actions. Franklin Lee Burris, age 33 at the time of his arrest, was charged with first-degree murder and held without bond. The decision to deny him bail reflected both the severity of the charges and the court's assessment of the danger he might pose if released. His initial bail hearing was rescheduled multiple times, ultimately being continued to September 23 in Fluvanna County General District Court. The legal proceedings that followed would drag on for years, a common occurrence in serious criminal cases as both sides prepared their arguments and navigated the complex legal process. For Taylor's family and friends, this extended timeline meant years of reliving the trauma, of waiting for justice, of seeing Franklin's face in courtrooms and news reports as the case slowly made its way through the system. During bond hearings, prosecutors presented new details about the murder that painted a picture of the brutal violence that had characterized Taylor's final moments. These details, while necessary for the legal process, were undoubtedly agonizing for those who had loved Taylor to hear. The young woman who had been full of life and promise had suffered tremendously before her death. The case remained in the court system for nearly a decade, a testament to the complexity of the legal process and perhaps also to Franklin's attempts to avoid accountability for his actions. During this time, Taylor's family and friends had to live with the knowledge that her killer was still alive, still fighting the charges, still refusing to take full responsibility for what he had done. It wasn't until December 2023, more than 8 years after Taylor's murder, that Franklin finally accepted responsibility for his actions. In a plea agreement, Franklin Burris pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in the death of his wife. As part of this agreement, his original first-degree murder charge was downgraded, with the language being changed to remove with premeditation and include the word maliciously. During the proceedings, prosecutor Jeff Hayslip reviewed the facts of the case, including evidence of the tumultuous relationship that had led to Taylor's brutal death. The court heard how Franklin had begun his relationship with Taylor 10 years earlier, when he was 25 years old and she was just 14. This detail, stated in open court, underscored the fundamental power imbalance that had characterized their relationship from its very beginning. The plea agreement meant that Franklin would face a significant prison sentence, though not the life sentence that might have resulted from a first-degree murder conviction. He faced up to 40 years in prison for his crime, a substantial punishment that reflected the severity of what he had done to Taylor. For Taylor's family and friends, Franklin's guilty plea may have brought some measure of closure, but it could never bring back the young woman whose life had been stolen from her. The legal process had finally acknowledged what everyone who knew them had understood for years, that Franklin's relationship with Taylor had been destructive and dangerous from the beginning, and that his controlling behavior had ultimately escalated to the most extreme form of domestic violence. The case serves as a stark reminder of the deadly potential of controlling relationships, particularly those that begin when one partner is very young and vulnerable. Taylor's story illustrates how patterns of control and abuse can become normalized over time, how the victim can become so accustomed to the dysfunction that they struggle to recognize the danger they're in or to break free from the relationship. It also highlights the particular vulnerability of young people who become involved with much older partners. The age gap between Franklin and Taylor, 11 years, might not seem significant in other contexts, but when it involves a relationship between a 25-year-old adult and a 14-year-old child, it creates a dynamic of inherent inequality that can have devastating long-term consequences. Taylor's murder occurred during a period of growing awareness about domestic violence and its warning signs. In recent years, there has been increased focus on educating people about the patterns of controlling behavior that often precede domestic violence, the importance of early intervention, and the resources available to help people escape dangerous relationships. Yet despite this growing awareness, cases like Taylor's continue to occur with tragic regularity. Every year, hundreds of women are killed by current or former intimate partners. Many of these cases follow similar patterns: long-term relationships characterized by control and violence, victims who have been isolated from their support networks, escalating danger as the victim attempts to leave or as the abuser's control begins to slip. Taylor's story reminds us that domestic violence can happen anywhere, in any community, to anyone. The peaceful setting of Lake Monticello, the seemingly ordinary nature of the Burris household, the fact that their relationship had continued for so many years, none of these factors protected Taylor from the ultimate consequences of Franklin's controlling and violent behavior. As we conclude this tragic tale, we remember Taylor not as a victim, but as a young woman who deserved so much more than the life she was given. She deserved to grow up free from adult manipulation and control. She deserved to discover who she was meant to be without having her identity shaped by someone else's need for dominance. She deserved to live a full life, to pursue her dreams, to experience love that lifted her up rather than tearing her down. Her story serves as both a tragedy and a warning, a reminder of the importance of recognizing the signs of controlling relationships, of supporting those who may be trapped in dangerous situations, and of understanding that domestic violence can escalate to deadly consequences with shocking suddenness. Please, if you're enjoying this stories, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 3. Tonight, we're diving deep into a case that has captivated Colorado and the nation for over 5 years, a story of love, betrayal, and a Mother's Day that would forever change a family. This is the story of Suzanne Morphew, a vibrant 49-year-old mother who vanished without a trace on May 10, 2020, setting off a chain of events that would expose dark secrets, questionable alibis, and ultimately lead to one of the most complex murder cases in recent Colorado history. Suzanne Morphew was a beloved mother, wife, sister, and friend. Her story deserves to be told with respect and dignity, and tonight, we honor her memory by seeking the truth about what happened on that fateful Mother's Day. So let me take you through every twist and turn of this incredible case, from the initial disappearance that sparked the largest search in Colorado history, to the recent indictment that has brought new hope for justice. To understand what happened to Suzanne Morphew, we need to first understand who she was and the life she had built in the picturesque mountain town of Salida, Colorado. Suzanne was born in 1971 in Alexandria, Indiana, where she grew up in a close-knit family that valued education, hard work, and togetherness. She was described by those who knew her as naturally beautiful, with an infectious smile and a warm personality that drew people to her. In the early 1990s, Suzanne met Barry Morphew, a tall, athletic man who worked in construction and had dreams of building his own business empire. Their courtship was like something out of a romance novel. Barry was charming, confident, and determined to win Suzanne's heart. He pursued her relentlessly, showering her with attention and promises of a beautiful future together. They married in 1994, and for the outside world, they appeared to be the perfect couple. Barry's construction business, which he eventually named after himself, began to flourish. The Morphews lived comfortably, first in Indiana, where they welcomed their 2 daughters, Mallory and Macy. The girls were everything to Suzanne. She threw herself into motherhood with the same enthusiasm she brought to everything else in her life. She was the type of mother who never missed a school play, who volunteered for every field trip, and who made sure her daughters knew they were loved unconditionally. As Barry's business grew more successful, the family began spending more time in Colorado, drawn by the outdoor lifestyle and the natural beauty of the Rocky Mountains. Barry was an avid hunter and outdoorsman, and Colorado offered him the kind of wilderness access he craved. In 2018, the Morphews made the decision to relocate permanently to Salida, a charming town of about 5,000 people nestled in the Arkansas River Valley. Salida was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where you could leave your doors unlocked and trust your neighbors. The Morphews purchased a beautiful $1.7 million home on Puma Path, a secluded property that offered stunning mountain views and the privacy that Barry seemed to prefer. The house sat on 35 acres of pristine Colorado landscape, complete with hiking trails, wildlife, and the kind of natural beauty that made it feel like a slice of heaven. Suzanne embraced their new life in Colorado with characteristic enthusiasm. She quickly became involved in the community, making friends and establishing herself as someone who could be counted on. She was particularly passionate about helping others and had a special gift for making people feel welcomed and valued. Her daughters, now teenagers, were thriving as well. Both were accomplished athletes and students who seemed to have inherited their mother's warmth and their father's competitive drive. From the outside, the Morphews appeared to have achieved the American dream. They had financial success, a beautiful home, healthy children, and lived in one of the most beautiful places in the country. But as we would later learn, the picture-perfect facade was hiding some troubling crackets. While the Morphews projected an image of marital bliss, those closest to Suzanne began to notice subtle changes in her demeanor over the years. Friends and family members would later tell investigators that Suzanne had grown increasingly unhappy in her marriage, though she rarely spoke about it directly. She was the type of person who internalized her struggles, always putting on a brave face and focusing on being strong for her daughters. The first major crack in the marriage facade came to light through Suzanne's cell phone records, which would later become crucial evidence in the case. In late 2019 and early 2020, Suzanne had been exchanging messages with an old high school flame named Jeff Leibler. What started as innocent reminiscing about their teenage years had gradually evolved into something more intimate and emotionally significant. Jeff Leibler lived in Michigan and was married with children of his own, but the rekindled connection with Suzanne seemed to awaken feelings that had been dormant for decades. Their text messages, which investigators would eventually recover, revealed a woman who was desperately unhappy in her marriage and seeking emotional connection elsewhere. Suzanne confided in Jeff about feeling isolated and unappreciated, describing a husband who was increasingly controlling and dismissive of her needs and feelings. The messages painted a picture of a woman who felt trapped in her own life. Suzanne wrote about feeling like she was walking on eggshells around Barry, never knowing what might set off his temper. She described feeling lonely even when surrounded by her family, and expressed fears about what might happen if she tried to leave the marriage. These weren't the words of a woman in a happy, healthy relationship, they were the desperate pleas of someone who felt like she was drowning. Barry, meanwhile, seemed to be oblivious to his wife's emotional distress, or perhaps he simply chose to ignore it. Friends and neighbors described him as someone who was very set in his ways, traditional in his views about marriage and family roles, and not particularly given to emotional expression or introspection. He was the type of man who believed that providing financially for his family was equivalent to loving them, and he seemed genuinely surprised when anyone suggested that his approach to relationships might be lacking. The Morphew marriage had also been strained by financial pressures that weren't immediately apparent to outsiders. While Barry's construction business had been successful for many years, the industry was competitive and cyclical. There had been some lean periods, and Barry had begun taking on increasingly risky projects to maintain their lifestyle. This financial stress, combined with the challenges of raising teenage daughters and adjusting to life in a new state, had created a perfect storm of marital tension. Suzanne's relationship with Jeff Leibler had given her something she hadn't experienced in years, the feeling of being truly seen and appreciated for who she was as a person, not just as a wife and mother. Their connection was primarily emotional and intellectual rather than physical, but it represented something profound for Suzanne, the possibility that there was more to life than the increasingly hollow shell of her marriage. As 2020 began, Suzanne found herself at a crossroads. Her daughters were growing up and would soon be heading off to college, which meant that the primary reason she had stayed in an unhappy marriage, to provide stability for her children, would no longer be as compelling. She began to seriously consider what her life might look like if she had the courage to make a change. The COVID-19 pandemic, which began affecting Colorado in March 2020, added another layer of stress to an already fragile situation. The lockdowns meant that the Morphews were spending more time together than they had in years, which only served to highlight the emotional distance between them. Barry's business was also affected by the pandemic, creating additional financial uncertainty and stress. By April 2020, those closest to Suzanne could see that she was building up to making some kind of major decision about her future. She had become more secretive about her phone usage, more distant from Barry, and more focused on planning what she might do next. She had even begun quietly researching divorce attorneys, though she hadn't yet taken any concrete steps toward ending her marriage. What Suzanne didn't know was that Barry had become suspicious of her behavior and had begun monitoring her activities more closely. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would have devastating consequences. Mother's Day 2020 dawned bright and beautiful in Salida, Colorado. The weather was perfect for outdoor activities, sunny skies, mild temperatures, and the kind of crisp mountain air that made you want to spend the entire day outside. For many families in the area, it would be a day of celebration, gratitude, and quality time together. For the Morphew family, it would be the beginning of a nightmare that continues to this day. According to Barry Morphew's initial statements to investigators, the morning began normally. He claimed that he and Suzanne had breakfast together, discussed their plans for the day, and that everything seemed fine between them. Barry said he had to leave early for a landscaping job in Denver, about a 3-hour drive from their home. This was supposedly a pre-planned work commitment that couldn't be postponed, even for Mother's Day. Suzanne's daughters, Mallory and Macy, were not home that weekend. They were both away at college and had made other plans for the holiday, which meant that Suzanne would be spending Mother's Day alone, something that those who knew her said would have been particularly difficult for her, given how much she valued family time and how central her role as a mother was to her identity. According to Barry's account, Suzanne had planned to spend the day doing one of her favorite activities, mountain biking. The area around their home offered numerous trails that were perfect for cycling, and Suzanne was an experienced rider who often used biking as a way to clear her head and enjoy the natural beauty of their surroundings. Barry claimed that she had mentioned wanting to try a new trail and that she seemed excited about having some solo time to explore. However, as investigators would later discover, Barry's account of that morning was filled with inconsistencies and details that didn't quite add up. Phone records would show that there had been unusual activity on both Barry's and Suzanne's devices in the early morning hours of May 10, suggesting that whatever happened that day had actually begun much earlier than Barry initially claimed. The first concrete piece of evidence in the case came from Suzanne's bicycle, which was discovered later that day on County Road 225, also known as the Butterfly Trail, about a mile from the Morphew home. The bike was found lying on its side near the road, with what appeared to be signs that it had been hastily placed rather than fallen naturally. There was no sign of Suzanne anywhere in the vicinity. What made the discovery of the bicycle particularly suspicious was its location and condition. Experienced mountain bikers in the area noted that the spot where the bike was found wasn't consistent with someone taking a planned ride. It was more like someone had driven there and quickly disposed of the bicycle. The bike itself showed no signs of damage that would indicate an accident or fall, and Suzanne's helmet was still securely fastened to the handlebars, which was unusual for someone who was actually riding. Meanwhile, Barry's movements on May 10 would become a crucial part of the investigation. He claimed to have left home around 5:30 a.m. for his work trip to Denver, where he was supposed to be helping prepare several hotel properties for reopening after COVID-19 shutdowns. However, phone records and GPS data would later show a much more complex pattern of movements that didn't align with his stated itinerary. Barry's phone records showed that his device had been turned off for several hours during the early morning of May 10, which he initially claimed was because he had fallen asleep and forgotten to charge it. However, investigators found this explanation suspicious, particularly given that Barry was typically very attentive to his phone and rarely let the battery die. When Barry did arrive in Denver later that morning, his behavior struck several people as odd. Co-workers who saw him that day described him as seeming distracted and nervous, not his usual confident self. He made several unusual phone calls and seemed preoccupied with checking his messages, which was out of character for someone who was typically focused and professional when working. The timeline of events on May 10 becomes even more complicated when you consider the various automated systems and digital footprints that were tracking movements throughout the day. The Morphew home was equipped with security cameras and sensors, and both Barry and Suzanne carried phones that were constantly generating location and usage data. As investigators began piecing together this digital evidence, a picture emerged that was very different from Barry's simple story about a work trip and a bike ride. One of the most significant pieces of evidence from that morning was a series of text messages that were sent from Suzanne's phone to Barry around 2:30 a.m. The messages were uncharacteristically affectionate and seemed designed to establish a positive narrative about their relationship. Investigators found this suspicious because it was unusual for Suzanne to be awake and texting at that hour, and the tone of the messages didn't match the pattern of communication that had been established between the couple in the months leading up to her disappearance. As the day progressed and Suzanne failed to return home or respond to messages from friends and family, concern began to grow. Suzanne was known for being reliable and communicative, particularly with her daughters. When she didn't respond to their Mother's Day messages and didn't answer her phone, those who knew her best immediately sensed that something was wrong. By late afternoon on May 10, it became clear that something was seriously wrong. Suzanne had missed several scheduled phone calls with friends and family, including an important conversation with her daughters that she had been looking forward to all week. When her neighbor, Jean Ritter, couldn't reach Suzanne and noticed that she hadn't returned from her bike ride, the decision was made to contact law enforcement. The initial response from the Chaffee County Sheriff's Office was swift and comprehensive. Sheriff John Spetz, who would become the public face of the investigation, immediately recognized that this was potentially a serious situation. Suzanne Morphew wasn't the type of person who would simply disappear without telling anyone where she was going, and the discovery of her abandoned bicycle suggested that something had gone wrong during what should have been a routine morning ride. The search for Suzanne began immediately and would quickly grow into one of the largest missing persons searches in Colorado history. Within hours of the initial report, dozens of law enforcement officers, search and rescue volunteers, and community members were scouring the rugged terrain around Salida, looking for any sign of the missing mother. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation was called in to assist with the case, bringing with them specialized equipment and expertise in handling complex missing person investigations. Search teams used helicopters, drones, all-terrain vehicles, and tracking dogs to cover the vast wilderness area surrounding the Morphew home. The terrain was challenging: steep mountains, dense forests, rushing streams, and countless places where someone could become lost or injured. Barry Morphew's reaction to news of his wife's disappearance was closely watched by investigators from the very beginning. When he was contacted in Denver and told that Suzanne was missing, his response struck many as oddly calm and detached. Rather than immediately rushing home to join the search, he continued with his work commitments for several more hours, claiming that he needed to finish what he had started. When Barry finally did return to Salida that evening, his behavior continued to raise red flags for experienced investigators. He seemed more concerned with controlling the narrative around Suzanne's disappearance than with actually finding her. He immediately began giving interviews to local media, portraying himself as a devoted husband who was desperate to find his beloved wife. In these early interviews, Barry's story about the events of May 10 was relatively simple and straightforward. He claimed that he and Suzanne had enjoyed a pleasant morning together, that she had seemed happy and relaxed, and that her decision to go mountain biking was completely normal and expected. He portrayed their marriage as loving and stable, describing Suzanne as his best friend and the love of his life. However, investigators were already beginning to uncover evidence that contradicted Barry's public statements. Phone records showed that there had been very little communication between Barry and Suzanne in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, which was unusual for a couple who were supposedly as close as Barry claimed. Financial records revealed that Barry had been having serious money problems that he hadn't disclosed to investigators, and witness statements from people who knew the couple suggested that their marriage was far from the fairy tale that Barry was describing to the media. The search for Suzanne continued around the clock for the first several days, with hundreds of volunteers joining law enforcement in combing through the wilderness. The community response was overwhelming. Local businesses donated food and supplies, residents opened their homes to out-of-town searchers, and social media was flooded with appeals for information about Suzanne's whereabouts. As the search expanded, investigators began to focus more closely on the timeline of events surrounding Suzanne's disappearance. They conducted detailed interviews with everyone who had been in contact with Suzanne in the days and weeks before May 10, trying to piece together her state of mind and any potential threats she might have been facing. One of the most significant early discoveries was the extent of Suzanne's communication with Jeff Leibler, her former high school boyfriend. When investigators examined Suzanne's phone records and social media accounts, they found evidence of an ongoing emotional relationship that had been developing for months. This revelation added a new dimension to the case and raised questions about whether Suzanne's disappearance might be related to marital problems that Barry had been trying to hide. The discovery of Suzanne's relationship with Jeff Leibler also provided investigators with a potential motive for violence. If Barry had discovered his wife's emotional affair, it could have triggered a confrontation that escalated beyond what anyone intended. This theory was supported by the timing of certain phone calls and text messages that suggested Barry might have been monitoring Suzanne's communications in the days before she disappeared. As the first week of the search concluded without any sign of Suzanne, investigators began to shift their focus from a missing person case to a potential homicide investigation. The evidence was beginning to suggest that Suzanne hadn't simply gotten lost or injured during a bike ride. Something much more disturbing had occurred. As the investigation into Suzanne Morphew's disappearance deepened, digital evidence became the cornerstone of the case. In today's interconnected world, our phones, computers, and various smart devices create a detailed record of our movements, communications, and activities. For investigators working on the Morphew case, this digital footprint would prove to be both revealing and damning. The first major breakthrough came from analyzing the GPS and cellular data from both Barry and Suzanne's phones. This technology, which most people rarely think about, creates a detailed log of where our devices have been and when they were there. For Barry Morphew, whose phone had been mysteriously turned off for several crucial hours on the morning of May 10, this data would prove particularly problematic. Investigators discovered that Barry's phone had been manually turned off at 10:17 p.m. on May 9, which was unusual for someone who typically kept his phone charged and accessible at all times. The phone remained off until approximately 4:23 a.m. on May 10, during what Barry claimed were the peaceful final hours he spent with his wife. When pressed about this gap in his phone's activity, Barry offered several different explanations, none of which were particularly convincing. Even more concerning was what the GPS data revealed about Barry's movements after his phone was turned back on. Rather than showing a direct route from his home to Denver, as his story suggested, the data indicated multiple stops and detours that he had never mentioned to investigators. His phone had pinged cell towers in locations that were nowhere near the route he claimed to have taken, and the timing of these pings suggested that he had been making stops that could have involved disposing of evidence. Suzanne's phone data told an equally troubling story. Her device showed normal activity patterns up until late on May 9, but then went silent in a way that suggested it had either been destroyed or moved to a location where it couldn't receive signals. The last known location for Suzanne's phone was somewhere near the family's property, not along the bicycle trail where her bike was found. One of the most significant pieces of digital evidence was a series of photographs that Barry had taken with his phone during his supposed work trip to Denver. These images, which Barry claimed were documentation of his landscaping work, were analyzed by forensic experts who discovered that several of them had been taken in locations that didn't match Barry's stated itinerary. Some of the photos appeared to have been taken near areas where investigators suspected evidence might have been disposed of. The investigation also revealed Barry's internet search history from the days and weeks leading up to Suzanne's disappearance. These searches painted a picture of a man who was deeply suspicious of his wife and possibly planning something sinister. Barry had searched for information about tracking someone's location through their phone, methods for permanently deleting text messages, and various topics related to divorce proceedings and asset protection. Perhaps most disturbing were searches related to tranquilizer drugs and their effects on the human body. Investigators discovered that Barry had been researching different types of sedatives, including some that were commonly used for veterinary purposes. This became particularly significant when Suzanne's autopsy results were eventually released, showing the presence of tranquilizer chemicals in her system. Barry's work as a landscaper had given him access to various chemicals and equipment that could potentially be used for nefarious purposes. His business involved the use of large machinery, heavy-duty disposal systems, and various chemicals for treating plants and soil. Investigators began to suspect that Barry might have used his professional knowledge and resources to cover up evidence of a crime. The financial records that investigators uncovered added another layer of complexity to the case. Despite Barry's public portrayal of himself as a successful businessman, the reality was that he was facing serious financial difficulties. His landscaping business owed significant amounts of money to various creditors, and there were liens against several of his properties. More troubling was the discovery that Barry had been forging Suzanne's signature on various financial documents, including loan applications and insurance policies. One particularly suspicious transaction involved a large life insurance policy on Suzanne that Barry had taken out just months before her disappearance. When questioned about this policy, Barry claimed that it was simply good financial planning, but investigators noted that the timing and amount of coverage seemed unusual for someone who claimed to be in a stable, loving marriage. The investigation also revealed that Barry had been monitoring Suzanne's communications more extensively than he had initially admitted. Her phone and computer showed signs of spyware installation, and Barry had apparently been reading her text messages and emails for months before her disappearance. This surveillance would have given him detailed knowledge of Suzanne's relationship with Jeff Leibler and her growing dissatisfaction with their marriage. As investigators pieced together this digital evidence, a clear pattern began to emerge. Barry Morphew had not been the devoted husband he claimed to be, and his actions in the days and weeks leading up to Suzanne's disappearance suggested someone who was planning for a future without his wife. The question was no longer whether Barry was involved in Suzanne's disappearance, it was what exactly had happened and whether there would be enough evidence to prove it in court. As 2020 progressed and the search for Suzanne Morphew continued without success, investigators began building a criminal case against Barry Morphew. The accumulation of circumstantial evidence, inconsistencies in his statements, and suspicious digital footprints had created a compelling narrative of guilt, even without Suzanne's body being found. The investigation was being led by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation in conjunction with the Chaffee County Sheriff's Office, and they were consulting with the District Attorney's Office about the possibility of filing charges. The challenge they faced was one that prosecutors encounter in many missing person cases: how do you prove murder without a body? Throughout the summer and fall of 2020, investigators continued to interview witnesses, analyze evidence, and build their case. They spoke with dozens of people who had known the Morphews, including friends, family members, business associates, and neighbors. A picture emerged of a marriage that was much more troubled than Barry had portrayed, and a man who had become increasingly controlling and suspicious in the months before his wife's disappearance. One of the most significant developments came when investigators were able to recover additional digital evidence from Barry's phone and computer. Forensic analysis revealed that Barry had been researching methods for disposing of bodies, information about how long it takes for organic matter to decompose in different environmental conditions, and various techniques for avoiding detection by law enforcement. The investigation also revealed that Barry had made several suspicious purchases in the weeks before Suzanne's disappearance. He had bought unusual quantities of bleach, plastic sheeting, and other cleaning supplies that investigators believed might have been used to clean up evidence of a crime. When questioned about these purchases, Barry claimed they were for his landscaping business, but investigators noted that the quantities and types of materials were inconsistent with his usual work patterns. In early 2021, investigators made a breakthrough when they were able to track down and interview Jeff Leibler, Suzanne's former high school boyfriend with whom she had been communicating. Leibler cooperated fully with the investigation and provided investigators with copies of all his communications with Suzanne. These messages painted a picture of a woman who was desperately unhappy in her marriage and seriously considering leaving her husband. Perhaps most importantly, Leibler's testimony established that Suzanne had been planning to meet with him in person for the first time in decades. They had discussed the possibility of her traveling to Michigan in the summer of 2020, after her daughters had settled into their summer plans. This potential meeting represented a significant escalation in their relationship and could have provided Barry with a motive for violence if he had discovered these plans. On May 5, 2021, almost exactly 1 year after Suzanne's disappearance, Barry Morphew was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, tampering with physical evidence, and attempting to influence a public servant. The arrest took place at his home in Salida, and Barry appeared shocked and indignant when officers informed him that he was being charged with his wife's murder. The arrest affidavit, which was released to the public, contained a detailed outline of the prosecution's case against Barry. It included evidence of his suspicious behavior on the day of Suzanne's disappearance, his inconsistent statements to investigators, the digital evidence showing his internet searches and movements, and testimony from witnesses about the state of the Morphew's marriage. Barry's daughters, Mallory and Macy, stood by their father throughout this ordeal. They issued public statements expressing their belief in his innocence and their conviction that he would never have harmed their mother. This family support was both heartbreaking and complicated. Two young women who had already lost their mother were now facing the possibility that their father might be responsible for her death. The case generated significant media attention, both locally in Colorado and nationally. True crime enthusiasts followed every development, and Barry's arrest was covered extensively by television news programs and podcasts. The story had all the elements that capture public attention: a beautiful victim, a suspicious husband, a mountain setting, and a mystery that had captivated investigators for over a year. Barry was released on a $500,000 bond while awaiting trial, which was scheduled for May 2022. During this period, he continued to maintain his innocence and gave several interviews to local media outlets. In these interviews, Barry portrayed himself as a grieving husband who was being wrongly accused by overzealous investigators who were under pressure to solve a high-profile case. However, as the trial date approached, the prosecution's case began to face some significant challenges. The lack of a body remained a major obstacle, and Barry's defense team was preparing to argue that Suzanne could still be alive and that the evidence against their client was entirely circumstantial. They planned to present alternative theories about what might have happened to Suzanne, including the possibility that she had left voluntarily to start a new life. The defense also began attacking the integrity of the investigation itself, arguing that investigators had focused on Barry to the exclusion of other potential suspects and explanations. They claimed that the prosecution was rushing to judgment based on incomplete evidence and that Barry was being made a scapegoat for what was actually an unsolved missing person case. As 2022 began, both sides were preparing for what promised to be a lengthy and complex trial. But just as it seemed like the case was finally heading toward resolution, unexpected developments would throw everything into chaos. In April 2022, just weeks before Barry Morphew was scheduled to go on trial for his wife's murder, the prosecution made a stunning announcement that would change the entire trajectory of the case. District Attorney Linda Stanley filed a motion to dismiss all charges against Barry, citing the discovery of new evidence and concerns about the strength of their case. The dismissal came as a shock to everyone involved in the case, including Barry's own defense team. For over 2 years, investigators and prosecutors had been building what they believed was a strong circumstantial case against Barry, only to suddenly decide that they couldn't proceed to trial. The decision raised serious questions about the quality of the investigation and the competence of the prosecution team. According to court documents, the prosecution's decision was based on several factors. First, they had discovered additional evidence that they believed needed to be thoroughly investigated before proceeding to trial. This evidence included new witness statements and digital data that had not been properly analyzed during the initial investigation. Second, there were concerns about the reliability of some of the prosecution's key pieces of evidence, including questions about the chain of custody for certain digital records. Perhaps most significantly, the prosecution had discovered that some potentially exculpatory evidence that might prove Barry's innocence, had not been properly disclosed to the defense team. This is a serious violation of prosecutorial ethics and legal requirements, and it raised the possibility that any conviction obtained at trial could be overturned on appeal. The prosecution's motion to dismiss the charges was filed without prejudice, which meant that they retained the right to refile charges at a later date if new evidence emerged or if the existing evidence could be properly organized and presented. However, the dismissal was still a major victory for Barry and a significant embarrassment for the prosecution team. Barry's defense attorney issued a statement expressing gratitude for the dismissal while maintaining that Barry had always been innocent of the charges. The statement emphasized that Barry had lost not only his wife but had also been forced to endure over 2 years of false accusations and public scrutiny. The defense team called for the investigation to be reopened with a focus on finding the real perpetrator of whatever crime had been committed against Suzanne. The dismissal also had significant implications for District Attorney Linda Stanley, who had been the public face of the prosecution's case against Barry. Critics began questioning her handling of the case and her decision-making throughout the investigation. Some legal experts suggested that the prosecution had been too eager to file charges before they had sufficient evidence to support a conviction, and that the dismissal was an inevitable result of rushing to judgment. For the Morphew family, the dismissal was both a relief and a source of renewed anguish. While Barry was no longer facing the possibility of life in prison, Suzanne was still missing and her fate remained unknown. The girls were left in the impossible position of being happy that their father was no longer facing charges while still grieving for their missing mother and wondering what had really happened to her. The case dismissal also had broader implications for missing person investigations in Colorado and beyond. Legal experts and law enforcement officials used the Morphew case as an example of the challenges involved in prosecuting crimes without physical evidence and the importance of thorough, methodical investigation work. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of rushing to judgment and the critical importance of following proper legal procedures even in high-profile cases. Meanwhile, the search for Suzanne continued, though with significantly less intensity and resources than during the initial investigation. Volunteer search groups continued to organize periodic searches of areas around Salida, and the Chaffee County Sheriff's Office maintained that the case remained active and ongoing. However, without new leads or evidence, the investigation had essentially reached a standstill. Barry Morphew returned to his life in Salida, though he found that the community's attitude toward him had changed significantly. While some neighbors and friends continued to support him and believe in his innocence, others remained suspicious and uncomfortable with his presence. The small town that had once welcomed the Morphew family with open arms was now divided and uncertain about what to believe. The case had also taken a significant financial toll on Barry, who had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on legal fees and had been unable to work regularly during the 2 years he was facing charges. His landscaping business had suffered, and he was forced to sell some properties to cover his expenses. The prosecution and defense of a major criminal case is expensive under the best of circumstances, and Barry's resources had been severely depleted by the legal process. As 2022 progressed, it seemed like the Suzanne Morphew case might fade into the category of unsolved mysteries, cases that generate intense initial interest but eventually become cold files in law enforcement offices. However, investigators were continuing to work behind the scenes, and developments that no one could have predicted were about to change everything once again. On September 22, 2023, more than 3 years after Suzanne Morphew's disappearance, investigators with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation were conducting a search related to an entirely different case when they made a discovery that would reignite the Morphew investigation. While searching for evidence in an unrelated matter near the small town of Moffett, Colorado, they found human remains that would later be identified as those of Suzanne Morphew. The discovery was made in a remote area about 45 miles south of the Morphew family home in Salida. The remains were found in what appeared to be a shallow grave in a location that was far from any established trails or roads, the kind of place that someone would only find if they were specifically looking for it or if they knew exactly where to go. The identification process was complicated by the fact that the remains had been exposed to the elements for over 3 years. However, forensic experts were able to use dental records and DNA analysis to confirm that the remains were indeed those of Suzanne Morphew. After more than 1,200 days of uncertainty, the Morphew family finally had confirmation of what many had suspected all along: Suzanne was dead. The discovery of Suzanne's remains immediately transformed the case from a missing person investigation back into a homicide case. The location where she was found provided investigators with crucial new evidence, including the fact that she had been buried in an area that was consistent with Barry's known travels and activities. GPS data from Barry's phone and vehicle showed that he had been in the vicinity of where Suzanne's body was found on multiple occasions, both before and after her disappearance. Perhaps most significantly, the autopsy results revealed the presence of animal tranquilizer in Suzanne's system. This finding was particularly damning because it correlated with Barry's internet searches about tranquilizer drugs and his access to veterinary sedatives through his landscaping work and connections in the hunting community. The specific type of tranquilizer found in Suzanne's system was not something that would be commonly available to the general public, but it was exactly the type of substance that someone with Barry's background might have access to. The cause of death was determined to be homicide, though the exact mechanism was difficult to determine due to the condition of the remains. What was clear was that Suzanne had not died accidentally and had not taken her own life. Someone had deliberately ended her life and then transported her body to a remote location where they hoped it would never be found. The discovery also provided investigators with physical evidence that had been missing during the first prosecution attempt. They now had a crime scene to process, potential DNA evidence to analyze, and a much clearer understanding of what had happened to Suzanne. The location of the burial site also supported the prosecution's theory about Barry's movements on the day of Suzanne's disappearance and in the days that followed. For Suzanne's family, the discovery brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief. While they finally had answers about what had happened to Suzanne, they were also forced to confront the reality that she had been murdered and that someone they had once trusted and loved was likely responsible for her death. The daughters, Mallory and Macy, were faced with the impossible situation of mourning their mother while potentially watching their father be charged with her murder once again. The discovery of Suzanne's remains also renewed public interest in the case. Media outlets that had covered the initial investigation and trial began reporting on the new developments, and true crime enthusiasts who had followed the case from the beginning were eager to see what would happen next. The case had all the elements of a compelling true crime story, but for those involved, it remained a tragic reality rather than entertainment. Law enforcement officials were careful not to reveal too many details about the discovery or the evidence they had recovered from the burial site. They had learned from the mistakes of the first prosecution attempt and were determined to build a more comprehensive and legally sound case before proceeding with new charges. However, it was clear that the discovery of Suzanne's remains had fundamentally changed the nature of the investigation. With Suzanne Morphew's remains finally recovered and a confirmed homicide on their hands, investigators and prosecutors began the painstaking process of building a new case against Barry Morphew. This time, they were determined to avoid the mistakes that had led to the dismissal of the original charges, and they had the advantage of physical evidence that had been missing during the first prosecution attempt. The discovery of Suzanne's body had provided investigators with several new avenues of evidence. The burial site itself yielded important clues about how and when Suzanne had been transported there. Forensic experts were able to analyze soil samples, vegetation patterns, and other environmental factors to create a timeline of when the body had been placed in that location. This analysis supported the prosecution's theory that Barry had disposed of Suzanne's body in the days immediately following her disappearance. The autopsy results were perhaps the most damning piece of new evidence. In addition to confirming the presence of animal tranquilizer in Suzanne's system, forensic pathologists were able to determine additional details about how she had died. While the exact cause of death remained difficult to pinpoint due to the condition of the remains, the evidence strongly suggested that Suzanne had been sedated before being killed, which supported the prosecution's theory that Barry had used his knowledge of tranquilizer drugs to subdue his wife. Investigators also had the benefit of 3 additional years of technological advances and analytical techniques. Digital forensics experts were able to extract and analyze data from Barry's devices using methods that hadn't been available during the initial investigation. This new analysis revealed additional evidence of Barry's suspicious behavior and planning in the days and weeks before Suzanne's disappearance. One of the most significant developments was the discovery of additional GPS and cellular data that had not been properly analyzed during the first investigation. This data provided a much more detailed picture of Barry's movements on May 10, 2020, and in the days that followed. The data showed that Barry had made multiple trips to areas near where Suzanne's body was eventually found, and that he had turned off his phone or put it in airplane mode during several of these trips, behavior that suggested he was trying to avoid creating a digital trail. The new investigation also benefited from additional witness testimony from people who had been reluctant to come forward during the initial investigation. Some of these witnesses provided information about Barry's behavior and statements in the months before Suzanne's disappearance, including conversations in which he had made veiled threats about what he might do if Suzanne ever tried to leave him. Perhaps most importantly, investigators had learned from the procedural mistakes that had derailed the first prosecution. They were much more careful about evidence handling, documentation, and disclosure requirements. Every piece of evidence was meticulously catalogued and analyzed, and the prosecution team worked closely with investigators to ensure that all legal requirements were being met. The new investigation also revealed additional evidence of Barry's financial motives for wanting Suzanne dead. Investigators discovered that Barry had been in even worse financial shape than originally thought, and that Suzanne's life insurance policy represented a significant potential windfall that could have solved many of his money problems. They also found evidence that Barry had been forging Suzanne's signature on financial documents for months before her disappearance, suggesting that he had been planning for a future without her for quite some time. The prosecution team was also able to strengthen their case by bringing in additional expert witnesses who could testify about various aspects of the evidence. These experts included specialists in digital forensics, forensic pathology, behavioral analysis, and financial crimes. Each expert could provide testimony that supported different aspects of the prosecution's theory about what had happened to Suzanne and why Barry had killed her. As the new investigation progressed, it became clear that the prosecution now had a much stronger case than they had possessed during the first attempt to prosecute Barry. The discovery of Suzanne's body had provided them with the physical evidence they had been lacking, and the additional time had allowed them to build a more comprehensive understanding of the crime and its aftermath. However, the prosecution team was also aware that they would face significant challenges in any new trial. Barry's defense team would undoubtedly argue that the previous dismissal of charges suggested that the prosecution's case was fundamentally flawed, and they would likely question why the same evidence that had been insufficient for trial in 2022 was suddenly adequate in 2024. The prosecution would need to clearly demonstrate that the discovery of Suzanne's body and the additional investigation had genuinely strengthened their case rather than simply providing them with another opportunity to prosecute someone they couldn't convict the first time. In August 2024, more than 4 years after Suzanne Morphew's disappearance and nearly a year after the discovery of her remains, a Chaffee County grand jury handed down a new indictment against Barry Morphew. The grand jury charged Barry with first-degree murder and tampering with a deceased human body in connection with his wife's death. The decision to seek a grand jury indictment rather than filing charges directly was a strategic choice by the prosecution. Grand jury proceedings are conducted in secret, which allowed prosecutors to present their evidence without the intense media scrutiny that had surrounded the first case. The grand jury process also provided an additional layer of legal review, with citizens evaluating whether there was sufficient evidence to support the charges rather than prosecutors making that determination alone. The new indictment was seen as a significant development in the case, as it suggested that prosecutors believed they now had sufficient evidence to successfully prosecute Barry for his wife's murder. The charges were similar to those filed in the original case, but the prosecution team expressed confidence that they were now better prepared to present a compelling case to a jury. Barry Morphew, now 57 years old, was arrested at his home in Salida and held on a $2 million bond. His daughters continued to support him, maintaining their belief in his innocence and expressing frustration with what they saw as continued persecution of their father. For them, the new charges represented another chapter in what had already been a devastating ordeal that had cost them both their mother and, potentially, their father. The case that will eventually go to trial represents one of the most complex and closely watched criminal cases in recent Colorado history. It involves sophisticated digital evidence, complex forensic analysis, and a web of financial and personal motives that prosecutors will need to clearly explain to a jury. The defense will undoubtedly argue that the evidence remains circumstantial and that reasonable doubt still exists about Barry's guilt. For the community of Salida, the case has been a source of fascination and division for more than 4 years. The small mountain town has been thrust into the national spotlight in a way that few residents ever expected, and the case has raised questions about domestic violence, the challenges of prosecuting crimes without witnesses, and the role of technology in modern criminal investigations. As this case moves toward trial, it serves as a reminder that behind every true crime story are real people whose lives have been forever changed by tragedy. Suzanne Morphew was a beloved mother, wife, sister, and friend whose life was cut short at the age of 49. Her daughters have had to navigate the unimaginable challenge of losing their mother while potentially watching their father be convicted of her murder. The case also highlights the evolution of criminal investigations in the digital age. The evidence against Barry Morphew consists largely of digital footprints, GPS data, internet searches, and cellular records, types of evidence that didn't exist just a few decades ago. This technology has given investigators powerful new tools for solving crimes, but it has also created new challenges for prosecutors who must explain complex technical evidence to juries. Whatever the outcome of Barry Morphew's trial, the case will likely be remembered as a landmark example of how modern criminal investigations work and the challenges of seeking justice in cases where the primary evidence is circumstantial. For those who knew and loved Suzanne Morphew, the hope is that the legal process will finally provide the answers and accountability that have been sought for more than 4 years. The story of Suzanne Morphew's disappearance and murder is ultimately a tragedy, the story of a woman who deserved better and a family that has been torn apart by violence and loss. As we conclude this examination of the case, we remember Suzanne not as a victim in a true crime story, but as a person who was loved and whose life had meaning and value far beyond the circumstances of her death. The search for justice continues, and perhaps someday soon, there will finally be answers and accountability for what happened on that Mother's Day morning in 2020 when Suzanne Morphew disappeared forever from the lives of those who loved her. Please, I'm putting it out there, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 4. Tonight, we journey to Meridian, Mississippi, to explore a case that spans over 13 years, a story of a family's unwavering love, a community's dedication, and the mystery that finally found its resolution in January 2025. This is the story of Julius Tadarius Jones, a 26-year-old man whose disappearance on a warm August evening in 2011 would leave his family searching for answers for more than a decade. It's a story about the last Sunday dinner, an unknown companion, and the long road to truth that sometimes takes longer than we hope, but eventually leads us home. To understand this story, we must first understand Tadarius himself. Julius Tadarius Jones was born into a close-knit family in Meridian, Mississippi, a city of about 40,000 people located in the eastern part of the state, near the Alabama border. Meridian had seen better days economically, but it remained a place where families had deep roots and neighbors looked out for one another. At 26, Tadarius was the kind of son every mother hopes to raise. His mother, Tabitha Jones, would later describe him as loving, dependable, and family-oriented, the type of young man who never missed a family gathering and always made time for Sunday dinner. He had that easy smile that lit up rooms and the kind of presence that made people feel comfortable in his company. Tadarius lived in the 1200 block of 39th Avenue, a modest residential area where porches faced the street and everyone knew their neighbors' names. He drove a Buick Century, not flashy, but reliable, the kind of car that would get you where you needed to go without drawing too much attention. Like many young men his age, Tadarius was navigating that phase of life where you're building your future while still being deeply connected to your family. He had dreams, plans, and people who depended on him. He was someone who showed up when he said he would, who called when he was supposed to call. This reliability, this dependability, would become crucial to understanding why his disappearance was so immediately alarming to those who knew him best. Tadarius wasn't the type to just disappear. He wasn't someone who would worry his family unnecessarily or leave without a word. In the summer of 2011, life in Meridian moved at its usual pace. The heat was typical for Mississippi in August, heavy, humid, the kind that made you appreciate air conditioning and sweet tea. It was a time when families gathered on Sundays, when the rhythm of the week was predictable, when people felt safe in their routines. Tadarius was part of that rhythm. He was woven into the fabric of his family's weekly traditions, their expectations, their sense of normalcy. And on Sunday, August 14, 2011, he participated in one of those traditions that would become, heartbreakingly, his last. Sunday, August 14, 2011, dawned like countless Sundays before it in the Jones household. The Mississippi sun rose over Meridian with that particular quality of light that promises another scorching day ahead. But inside the Jones family home, there was the comfortable bustle of Sunday dinner preparation, a tradition that had anchored their family for years. The menu that day was quintessentially Southern comfort food: golden fried chicken, creamy macaroni and cheese, and all the fixings that turn a meal into a celebration of family. Tabitha Jones moved around her kitchen with the practiced ease of a mother who had prepared countless Sunday dinners, seasoning and tasting, making sure everything was just right. For Tadarius, these Sunday gatherings weren't just meals, they were touchstones. In a world that could be unpredictable and challenging, Sunday dinner at his mother's table was a constant. It was where stories were shared, where family bonds were reinforced, where the week's events were processed and the coming week was anticipated. That particular Sunday, Tadarius arrived with his usual punctuality. He greeted his family members with hugs and smiles, settling into the comfortable rhythm of pre-dinner conversation. The house filled with the sounds that Tabitha Jones would later replay in her mind thousands of times: laughter, the clink of serving spoons against dishes, the scrape of chairs being pulled up to the table. They said grace, as they always did. They passed the dishes around the table, each person taking their favorite portions. Tadarius ate with the appetite of a healthy 26-year-old, complimenting his mother's cooking, engaging in the easy banter that families share over good food. The conversation that day was typical: work, plans for the week, family gossip, maybe some discussion of the weather or local events. Nothing seemed unusual, nothing seemed urgent or concerning. It was just another Sunday, just another family dinner, just another afternoon that felt like it would be followed by countless others just like it. But as the afternoon wore on and the meal wound down, Tadarius began to show signs that he had other plans for the evening. He helped clear the table, as he always did. His mother had raised him right, but there was an energy about him that suggested he was looking forward to going out. Evening plans weren't unusual for Tadarius. He was 26, after all, and Sunday evenings were often social times for young people in Meridian. Maybe he planned to meet friends, maybe there was someone special he wanted to see, maybe he just felt like driving around on a pleasant evening. What his family would later remember most clearly wasn't the fact that he was planning to go out, that was normal. What they would remember was how typical everything felt, how normal, how utterly unremarkable. There were no arguments, no tensions, no signs of distress or worry. Tadarius was simply Tadarius, loving, present, engaged with his family. As the sun began to set over Meridian that evening, casting long shadows across 39th Avenue, Tadarius prepared to leave. He hugged his family members goodbye, told them he loved them, words that would later take on profound significance, and headed toward the door. His mother, Tabitha, called out the things mothers always call out: be careful, don't stay out too late, call me. Normal words, routine words, the kind of maternal send-off that had been spoken in that house hundreds of times before. Tadarius assured her he would be careful, that he would be in touch. He walked to his Buick Century, got in, and drove away from 39th Avenue as the Mississippi evening settled around him. None of them knew, as they watched his taillights disappear down the street, that this moment, this ordinary, unremarkable moment, would be the last time they would see Tadarius alive. The Sunday dinner dishes were washed and put away. The family members went about their evening routines. The house settled into the quiet that comes after a gathering, that peaceful aftermath of shared time and shared meals. But somewhere out in the warm Meridian evening, something was about to go terribly wrong. As Tadarius drove away from his family home that evening, he was entering what would become the most mysterious and crucial hours of this entire story. What happened next has been the subject of investigation, speculation, and heartbreak for over 13 years. According to the police reports that would later be filed, Tadarius was last seen near his residence in the 1200 block of 39th Avenue. But he wasn't alone. The witness who provided this final sighting reported seeing Tadarius with an unknown female. This detail, the unknown female, would become one of the most significant and frustrating aspects of the entire case. Who was she? How did Tadarius know her? Where did they meet, and where were they going together on that Sunday evening? The witness description was necessarily limited, as such sightings often are. Tadarius was wearing a white t-shirt, cargo shorts, and plaid flip-flops, the casual attire of a young man heading out on a warm summer evening. The clothing was typical, unremarkable, the kind of outfit that wouldn't stand out in any crowd. But the presence of this unknown female companion raised immediate questions when Tadarius was reported missing. Had this been a planned meeting? Was this someone from his social circle that his family simply hadn't met? Or was this an encounter that happened spontaneously, perhaps someone he met while he was out and about? The investigators would later pursue this lead exhaustively, but the unknown female seemed to vanish as completely as Tadarius himself. Despite appeals to the public, despite the circulation of missing person flyers, despite the family's desperate pleas for information, no one ever came forward to identify themselves as the woman who was with Tadarius during his final known moments. This has led to various theories over the years. Some wondered if the woman was connected to whatever happened to Tadarius, whether she was a victim herself, a witness, or somehow involved in his disappearance. Others theorized that she might have been a casual acquaintance who didn't realize the significance of their time together until it was too late, and who then became afraid to come forward. What we know for certain is that after this sighting, Tadarius Jones seemed to vanish from the face of the earth. There were no phone calls home, no contact with friends, no activity on any accounts or cards he might have had. It was as if he had simply stepped out of his own life and into a void. The evening of August 14th passed into night, and night into the early hours of August 15th, Monday morning arrived in Meridian with its usual summer heat and humidity, and for most people, it was just another start to another week. But for the Jones family, Monday morning brought a growing sense of unease. Tadarius hadn't come home. There had been no phone call, no message, no explanation. For a young man who was reliable and family-oriented, this silence was completely out of character. As Monday stretched into Tuesday, the worry deepened. Family members began making phone calls, checking with friends, trying to piece together Tadarius's movements and plans. But they were met with the same response everywhere: no one had seen him, no one had heard from him, no one knew where he might be. The warm summer days that had felt so pleasant just days before now seemed oppressive and threatening. Every hour that passed without word from Tadarius made the situation feel more dire, more frightening, more inexplicable. By Tuesday, August 16th, the family knew they couldn't wait any longer. Whatever was happening, wherever Tadarius was, this was not normal. This was not the behavior of the son, brother, and family member they knew and loved. It was time to call the police. On August 16, 2011, a family member picked up the phone and made the call that would officially begin one of Meridian's most enduring missing person cases. The Meridian Police Department received the report that Julius Tadarius Jones, 26 years old, had been missing for 2 days. Detective work in small cities like Meridian often relies heavily on community knowledge and local connections. The officers who responded to the missing person report knew the importance of acting quickly, especially when the missing person's behavior was so completely out of character. The initial investigation followed standard protocols. Officers took detailed statements from family members, gathering information about Tadarius's appearance, his clothing, his vehicle, his usual haunts, and his state of mind during his last known interactions. They created a timeline of his movements and began the process of circulating his information through law enforcement networks. Tadarius and his Buick Century were listed on a nationwide network as missing persons. His description went out to police departments across Mississippi and beyond: a 26-year-old black male, last seen wearing a white t-shirt, cargo shorts, and plaid flip-flops, driving a Buick Century. The family provided recent photographs, and these began appearing on missing person flyers that would soon become a familiar sight around Meridian. Tadarius's face looked out from telephone poles, community bulletin boards, and store windows, a young man with a warm smile who had simply vanished. As the investigation gained momentum, several sightings were reported to the Meridian Police Department. In cases like this, reported sightings are both a blessing and a curse for investigators. Each one represents hope. Maybe this is the lead that will bring Tadarius home. But each one also requires time and resources to investigate, and most turn out to be cases of mistaken identity or wishful thinking. The investigators followed up on each reported sighting with professional thoroughness, but none yielded concrete information about Tadarius's whereabouts or what had happened to him. Then came the discovery that would transform the case from a missing person investigation into something much more ominous. A few days after Tadarius was reported missing, his Buick Century was found. The location was significant. It was discovered on 27th Street in Meridian, not far from where he lived but in an area where it clearly didn't belong. The car was abandoned, sitting silent and empty in a location where Tadarius had no known reason to be. The discovery of the vehicle marked a crucial turning point in the investigation. When a missing person's car is found abandoned, it usually means one of two things: either the person left voluntarily and abandoned their vehicle for some reason, or something happened to them against their will. Given everything the family and investigators knew about Tadarius, his character, his family connections, his reliability, the voluntary abandonment theory seemed highly unlikely. This was not a young man who would disappear by choice, leaving his family to worry and wonder. Police processed the Buick Century thoroughly, searching for any clues that might explain what had happened. They dusted for fingerprints, looking for evidence of other people who might have been in the car. They examined the interior and exterior for signs of struggle, violence, or anything unusual. But the car, like Tadarius himself, seemed to offer no answers. There was no sign of struggle, no obvious evidence of foul play, no clear indication of what had happened or where Tadarius might be. The investigation expanded to include searches of the area where the car was found. Officers walked through nearby neighborhoods, checked with local residents, and examined the surrounding terrain for any sign of Tadarius or clues to his disappearance. They also conducted searches of local waterways, including a creek near where the car was found. Water searches are always emotionally difficult for families, representing as they do the possibility that their loved one may have met with the worst possible fate. But like everything else in this case, the water search yielded no answers. There was no sign of Tadarius in the creek, no evidence that he had been there, no clues to suggest what direction the investigation should take next. As the days turned into weeks, the initial urgency of the investigation began to settle into the longer, more methodical process of a complex missing person case. The Meridian Police Department continued to pursue leads, continued to follow up on tips, continued to hope for the breakthrough that would solve the mystery. But Tadarius Jones seemed to have vanished as completely as if he had never existed at all. While investigators worked their leads and processed evidence, the Jones family was living through every parent's worst nightmare. Tabitha Jones, Tadarius's mother, found herself thrust into a reality she had never imagined, the limbo of not knowing whether her son was alive or dead, safe or in danger, near or far. The days immediately following Tadarius's disappearance were a blur of police interviews, phone calls, and desperate attempts to maintain hope while fearing the worst. Tabitha found herself replaying that last Sunday dinner over and over in her mind, searching for any detail she might have missed, any sign that could have predicted what was to come. The guilt that parents feel in situations like this is profound and irrational but utterly real. Had she missed something? Should she have asked more questions when Tadarius said he was going out? Should she have insisted he stay home that evening? The what-ifs and if-onlys became a constant refrain in her thoughts. But Tabitha Jones was not the type of woman to be paralyzed by grief and uncertainty. As the official investigation continued, she began her own campaign to find her son. She created missing person flyers and distributed them throughout Meridian and beyond. She organized search parties and coordinated with volunteers who wanted to help. The family established a post office box specifically for tips and information about Tadarius's case. They hoped that someone, somewhere, might have seen something or know something that could help bring him home. The community response was heartening. People who had never met Tadarius or his family offered their time, their resources, and their prayers. Local media picked up the story, and Tadarius's disappearance became a regular feature in Meridian news coverage. His photograph appeared in newspapers and on television screens throughout the region. The hope was that increased visibility might jog someone's memory or encourage someone with information to come forward. As weeks turned into months, the family had to face the possibility that Tadarius might not be coming home soon, or at all. This realization brought its own set of challenges. How do you plan a future when you don't know if your loved one is alive or dead? How do you move forward while still holding on to hope? Tabitha Jones made a decision that would define the next 13 years of her life. She would never stop looking for her son. She would never stop asking questions, never stop hoping for answers, never stop believing that someday she would know what happened to Tadarius. She formed a support group for families dealing with missing persons cases, understanding that the specific kind of grief and uncertainty she was experiencing was something that only others in similar situations could truly understand. The group became both a source of comfort and a platform for advocacy. The anniversaries were particularly difficult. Every August 14th brought renewed attention to Tadarius's case, renewed appeals for information, and renewed pain for the family. 5 years, 10 years, 13 years, each milestone marked not just the passage of time but the accumulation of unanswered questions and unresolved grief. During these years, Tabitha never let her son's case go cold in the public consciousness. She continued to speak to reporters, continued to distribute flyers, continued to make appeals for information. She appeared on television programs and spoke at community events, always carrying the same message: someone knows something about what happened to Tadarius Jones. The family's persistence was remarkable. Many missing person cases fade from public attention after the initial burst of coverage, but the Jones family kept Tadarius's story alive through their own determination and advocacy. They understood that public attention might be the key to finally getting the answers they desperately needed. Lynn Whitehead, a family friend who became deeply involved in the search efforts, later described the family's dedication: they never gave up. Even when the official investigation went cold, even when years passed without new leads, they kept looking, kept hoping, kept believing that someday they would bring Tadarius home. This dedication would prove to be prophetic, though none of them could have known that the answers they sought would come more than 13 years after that last Sunday dinner, and in a way that none of them could have predicted. As the official investigation into Tadarius Jones's disappearance continued, investigators and the community developed various theories about what might have happened to him. Each theory was pursued, each lead was followed, but none provided the breakthrough that everyone hoped for. The unknown female companion remained the most tantalizing and frustrating aspect of the case. Investigators spent countless hours trying to identify her, following up on tips and suggestions from the community. They interviewed Tadarius's friends and acquaintances, hoping someone might recognize the description or know who he might have been meeting that evening. Some theorized that this woman might have been someone Tadarius met casually, perhaps at a local establishment or through mutual friends. Others wondered if she might have been someone from outside Meridian, possibly explaining why no one in the local community could identify her. The location where Tadarius's car was found also generated theories. 27th Street, where the Buick Century was discovered, was in a different part of town from where Tadarius lived and was last seen. This raised questions about what might have brought him to that area, whether he drove there voluntarily, or whether the car was moved there by someone else after whatever happened to Tadarius. Some investigators theorized that Tadarius might have been the victim of a random crime, perhaps a robbery gone wrong or a carjacking. The fact that his car was found abandoned but apparently undamaged suggested that if this was the case, the perpetrator might have panicked and fled after taking Tadarius somewhere else. Others wondered if Tadarius might have become involved in something more complex, perhaps witnessing something he shouldn't have seen, or becoming entangled in a situation that he couldn't escape from. The complete lack of communication from Tadarius after his disappearance suggested that he was either unable to contact his family or was being prevented from doing so. The family, from the very beginning, believed that Tadarius had met with foul play. They knew their son, knew his character and his habits, and they were convinced that he would never have disappeared voluntarily. This belief drove their determination to keep the case in the public eye and to continue searching for answers. As years passed, the case was officially classified as cold by the Meridian Police Department. This didn't mean that investigators had given up, but rather that they had exhausted their active leads and were waiting for new information to come to light. Cold cases are often solved when new technology becomes available, when witnesses who were previously afraid to come forward finally speak up, or when seemingly unrelated investigations uncover connections to older cases. The investigators working on Tadarius's case remained hopeful that one of these scenarios might eventually provide the breakthrough they needed. The community of Meridian never forgot Tadarius Jones. His case became part of the city's collective memory, a reminder that sometimes people simply vanish without explanation, leaving behind only questions and heartbreak. Local residents would sometimes claim to see him in crowds or passing by in cars, though these sightings never led to concrete discoveries. The rise of social media in the years following Tadarius's disappearance provided new avenues for keeping his case visible. Facebook pages and online forums dedicated to missing persons cases featured his story regularly. True crime enthusiasts and amateur investigators offered their own theories and suggestions, though none led to definitive answers. Television programs focusing on cold cases and missing persons occasionally featured Tadarius's story, bringing national attention to a case that might otherwise have remained purely local. These appearances generated new tips and renewed interest, but still no resolution. The persistence of the unknown female companion as a central mystery led to numerous theories over the years. Some suggested she might have been a victim herself. Others wondered if she might have been involved in whatever happened to Tadarius. Still others theorized that she might have been a witness who became too frightened to come forward. Each anniversary of Tadarius's disappearance brought renewed appeals for information, particularly focused on identifying this mysterious companion. The family and investigators never stopped believing that finding her might be the key to solving the entire case. But as the years accumulated, 5, 10, 13, it began to seem as though the mystery of Julius Tadarius Jones might remain forever unsolved, another cold case in a world full of unanswered questions and unresolved grief. None of them knew that the answer was literally buried, waiting to be discovered in the summer of 2024. August 2024 arrived in Meridian with the same oppressive heat that had characterized August 2011, when Tadarius Jones first disappeared. For 13 years, the calendar's return to this month had meant renewed pain for the Jones family, renewed appeals for information, and renewed hope that this might finally be the year they got answers. But in August 2024, something different happened. Something that would finally provide the closure the family had been seeking for more than a decade. It was in the 2300 block of 26th Street, not far from where Tadarius's abandoned car had been found 13 years earlier, that human remains were discovered. The discovery occurred during what appeared to be routine work or investigation in the area, though the exact circumstances that led to finding the remains have not been fully detailed in public reports. When human remains are discovered in a case like this, the process that follows is both meticulous and emotionally charged. The remains must be carefully excavated, preserved, and transported to forensic facilities where experts can begin the painstaking work of identification. For families of missing persons, the discovery of unidentified remains brings a complex mix of emotions. There is hope that finally, after years of uncertainty, they might get answers. But there is also fear that those answers might confirm their worst suspicions. The Jones family was notified of the discovery, but they faced months of waiting while forensic experts worked to determine the identity of the remains. Modern forensic science has made tremendous advances in recent decades, but the identification process still takes time, especially when remains have been in the ground for many years. DNA analysis became the primary method for attempting identification. This required obtaining DNA samples from Tadarius's family members and comparing them to genetic material extracted from the remains. The process is scientifically rigorous but can be emotionally exhausting for families who are waiting for results. During these months of waiting, the Jones family experienced a unique form of anticipation. After 13 years of not knowing, they were finally on the verge of getting answers. But those answers might confirm that Tadarius had been dead all along, that their years of hope and searching had been built on an impossible dream. The forensic work continued through the fall and into the winter of 2024. DNA extraction and analysis can be complicated when remains have been buried for extended periods, requiring specialized techniques and multiple attempts to obtain usable genetic material. Meanwhile, the Meridian Police Department began preparing for the possibility that these remains might indeed be Tadarius Jones. If the identification was confirmed, the case would transform from a missing person investigation into a homicide investigation, requiring a completely different approach and new areas of inquiry. The family tried to prepare themselves emotionally for whatever news might come. After 13 years of uncertainty, even tragic news might provide a form of relief, the relief of finally knowing, of finally being able to lay their loved one to rest, of finally being able to focus on seeking justice rather than seeking answers about basic survival. As 2024 turned into 2025, the forensic analysis neared completion. The scientists working on the case had successfully extracted DNA from the remains and were ready to make their comparison with the family's samples. On January 22, 2025, the Meridian Police Department called a press conference. After more than 13 years of investigation, after countless leads that went nowhere and tips that led to dead ends, they finally had definitive news about the fate of Julius Tadarius Jones. The remains found in the 2300 block of 26th Street had been positively identified as Tadarius Jones. The young man who had vanished after a Sunday dinner with his family in August 2011 had been found less than 2 miles from where his car was discovered all those years ago. For Tabitha Jones and her family, the news brought the complex emotions they had been preparing for. The relief of finally knowing was tempered by the confirmation of their worst fears. Tadarius had been dead all along. Their 13 years of hoping he might still be alive somewhere had been based on an impossibility. But there was also a sense of closure, of completion, of finally being able to bring their son and brother home. After 13 years of not knowing where he was, they could finally lay him to rest with the dignity and ceremony he deserved. The discovery also meant that Tadarius's case was no longer a missing person investigation. It was now officially a homicide, and investigators could focus their efforts on determining how he died and who might have been responsible. The identification of Tadarius Jones's remains in January 2025 provided the answer to the most basic question that had haunted his family for 13 years: what happened to him? But as is often the case when long-standing mysteries are finally resolved, answering one question only raised many others. The most immediate and pressing question was how Tadarius died. The Meridian Police Department was careful to emphasize that his death remained under investigation, indicating that they were treating this as a potential homicide rather than assuming any particular cause of death. Forensic examination of remains that have been buried for 13 years can provide some information about cause of death, but the condition of the remains and the passage of time can also limit what conclusions can be drawn. Modern forensic science is remarkably sophisticated, but it still has limitations when dealing with cases this old. The location where Tadarius's remains were found, the 2300 block of 26th Street, was particularly significant. This was not far from where his abandoned car had been discovered in 2011, suggesting that whatever happened to him occurred in a relatively confined geographic area. This proximity raised questions about the original investigation. Had the area where his remains were found been searched in 2011? If not, why not? If so, how were the remains missed? These are the kinds of questions that families and communities naturally ask when cases like this are resolved after so many years. The unknown female companion from that last evening became even more significant in light of the discovery. Investigators now knew that Tadarius had died sometime after he was seen with this woman, making her potentially one of the last people to see him alive. Whether she was a witness to his death, a victim herself, or somehow involved in what happened to him remained an open question. The family's reaction to the news was complex and deeply emotional. Speaking to reporters after the identification was announced, family members expressed both relief and continued anguish. "We have faith that the same God that has brought him home will reveal what has happened," one relative told the media. This statement captured the dual nature of their situation: gratitude for finally knowing Tadarius's fate, combined with determination to understand exactly how and why he died. The transformation of the case from a missing person investigation to a homicide investigation meant that new resources and approaches could be brought to bear. Detectives could now focus on the specific time frame around Tadarius's death, rather than trying to track his movements across 13 years of possibility. The Meridian Police Department faced the challenge of investigating a 13-year-old crime scene. Physical evidence that might have been available in 2011 could have deteriorated or been lost over time. Witnesses might have moved away, died, or forgotten crucial details. The passage of time makes every aspect of a homicide investigation more difficult. However, the department also had some advantages that hadn't existed in 2011. DNA technology had continued to advance, potentially allowing them to extract information from evidence that couldn't have been analyzed 13 years earlier. Digital forensics had also evolved dramatically, possibly providing new ways to trace Tadarius's final movements or communications. The community of Meridian reacted to the news with a mixture of sadness and determination. Many residents had followed Tadarius's case for years, had seen his missing person flyers, had hoped along with his family that he might someday return home safely. Learning that he had been dead all along was heartbreaking, but it also galvanized support for finding whoever was responsible. The family announced that Tadarius would finally be laid to rest, ending 13 years of uncertainty about his fate. The funeral provided an opportunity for the community to come together, to honor Tadarius's memory, and to support the family that had never given up searching for him. But even as they prepared to bury their son and brother, the Jones family made it clear that their quest for answers wasn't over. They wanted to know not just that Tadarius was dead, but how he died, who killed him, and why. They deserved those answers, and they were determined to get them. The investigation continued, now with the focus and urgency that comes with confirmed homicide. Detectives re-interviewed witnesses, re-examined evidence, and pursued new leads with the knowledge that they were no longer looking for a missing person but for a killer. The case that had begun with a worried family reporting their loved one missing had evolved into something much more complex and urgent, a hunt for justice that was 13 years in the making. As we reach the end of this long and winding story, it's important to reflect on what the case of Julius Tadarius Jones tells us about loss, hope, determination, and the complex nature of closure. For 13 years, the Jones family lived in a state of suspended animation, unable to fully grieve because they didn't know if there was anything to grieve. This particular kind of suffering, the agony of not knowing, is something that families of missing persons understand in ways that others cannot. Tabitha Jones's unwavering determination to find her son serves as a testament to the power of a mother's love and the importance of never giving up hope. Her 13-year campaign to keep Tadarius's case in the public eye, to continue searching for answers, to never let his memory fade, ultimately contributed to the resolution of his case. The identification of Tadarius's remains in January 2025 provided the family with something they had been seeking for over a decade: definitive answers about their loved one's fate. But it also demonstrated that closure is not a single moment or revelation. It's a process that continues even after the most basic questions are answered. The story of Tadarius Jones is also a story about community. Throughout the 13 years he was missing, the people of Meridian never forgot him. His case became part of the city's collective consciousness, a reminder that every person matters, that every disappearance deserves attention and investigation, that families deserve answers. The unknown female companion who was with Tadarius during his final known moments remains one of the most haunting aspects of this case. Somewhere, presumably, is a woman who knows more about Tadarius's final hours than anyone else alive. Whether she is a witness, a victim, or something else entirely, her identity and her story remain crucial missing pieces of this puzzle. For investigators, the case represents both vindication and challenge. The discovery of Tadarius's remains validated their belief that he had met with foul play, but it also presented them with the difficult task of solving a 13-year-old homicide. The techniques and technologies available in 2025 offer hope that questions which couldn't be answered in 2011 might finally be resolved. The case also highlights the evolution of missing person investigations over the past decade and a half. Social media, improved DNA technology, enhanced communication between law enforcement agencies, and increased public awareness of missing persons cases have all contributed to better outcomes for families seeking answers about their loved ones. As of now, the investigation into Tadarius's death continues. The Meridian Police Department has committed to pursuing every lead and exploring every possibility in their quest to determine how he died and who might be responsible. The family has made it clear that they will continue to advocate for justice, just as they advocated for answers during the 13 years Tadarius was missing. The transformation of this case from a missing person investigation to a homicide investigation represents a new chapter in a story that began with a Sunday dinner and a young man who simply didn't come home. It's a reminder that some stories take years or even decades to reach their conclusion, but that persistence, love, and determination can eventually lead to truth. For anyone listening to this story tonight, perhaps as you drift off to sleep, remember Julius Tadarius Jones, not just as a victim or a mystery, but as a beloved son, brother, and community member whose life mattered, whose disappearance was mourned, and whose memory will endure long after the final questions about his death are answered. The warm Mississippi evening of August 14, 2011, when Tadarius left his family's Sunday dinner for the last time, marked the beginning of a 13-year journey toward truth. That journey isn't over yet, but the family that never stopped searching finally knows where their loved one has been all along. And now, as the investigation continues and the search for justice begins in earnest, Tadarius Jones can finally rest in peace, surrounded by the love of the family that never gave up on bringing him home. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, we delve into a case that shook Milwaukee in the spring of 2024, a story that begins with the simple act of meeting someone new and ends in unthinkable tragedy. This is the story of Saad Carlina Robinson, a 19-year-old woman whose life was cut short on what should have been an ordinary first date. It's a case that would expose the dark underbelly of modern dating, the vulnerability we all face when we open our hearts to strangers, and the meticulous work of investigators who refuse to let a young woman's death go unanswered. The name Saad Robinson might not be familiar to everyone, but her story became a catalyst for change in how missing persons cases are handled, particularly for young women of color. Her case would ultimately reveal not just the actions of one dangerous individual, but systemic issues in dating safety and criminal investigation protocols. To understand the magnitude of what was lost, we must first understand who Saad Robinson was. Born and raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Saad was the kind of young woman who lit up every room she entered. At 19, she was in that beautiful phase of life where everything seemed possible, where dreams felt within reach, and where each day brought new opportunities for connection and growth. Saad worked at a local pizza restaurant, a job that might seem ordinary to some, but one that allowed her to interact with people from all walks of life. Her co-workers would later describe her as reliable, always showing up for her shifts with a smile, someone who took pride in even the smallest tasks. This wasn't just a paycheck for her, it was a stepping stone, a way to build independence while she figured out her next moves in life. Those who knew Saad described her as vibrant and social, someone who embraced the modern world of technology and social media as a way to connect with others. Like many of her generation, she navigated the complex landscape of online dating, apps, and digital relationships with a mix of caution and optimism. She understood the risks but, like millions of others, believed that genuine connections could be found in the digital age. Saad lived in Milwaukee, a city with its own unique character, a place where the shores of Lake Michigan meet urban neighborhoods, where old industrial heritage blends with modern development. It was a city she knew well, where she felt safe, where she had built relationships and established routines. This familiarity would become important later in our story, as investigators worked to piece together her final hours. Her social circle was tight-knit but not exclusive. Friends would describe her as someone who was open to meeting new people but not naive about the world's dangers. She had that balance that many young adults strive for, independent enough to make her own decisions, but connected enough to have people who cared about her well-being and would notice if something was wrong. In early 2024, Saad was exploring what many her age were exploring: dating, relationships, and the possibility of finding someone special. She had profiles on dating apps, engaged in conversations with potential matches, and occasionally met people in person. It was a normal part of her social life, something she approached with the same thoughtfulness she brought to other aspects of her existence. To understand how Saad came to meet Maxwell Anderson, we need to examine the landscape of modern dating in 2024. Dating apps had become not just common but the primary way young adults met potential partners. What had once been stigmatized was now normalized: swiping through profiles, exchanging messages with strangers, and eventually meeting in person had become as routine as any other social activity. But with this convenience came new risks and new vulnerabilities. The very anonymity that made online dating appealing also made it dangerous. People could misrepresent themselves, hide their true intentions, or worse. Young women, in particular, faced unique challenges in navigating this landscape safely. Saad, like millions of others, had to balance openness with caution. She had to decide who seemed trustworthy enough to meet in person, where to meet them, how much personal information to share, and when to trust her instincts if something felt wrong. These were calculations that earlier generations never had to make in quite this way. The protocols for safe dating had evolved along with the technology. Meet in public places. Tell friends where you're going and who you're meeting. Don't leave your drink unattended. Trust your gut if something feels off. These weren't just suggestions, they were survival tactics that young women shared with each other, passed down like folk wisdom in the digital age. Maxwell Anderson understood this landscape too, but from a predator's perspective. At 33 years old, he was significantly older than most people Saad would typically encounter on dating apps aimed at her age group. This age gap wasn't necessarily alarming on its own. Many relationships have significant age differences, but it would become important as investigators began to understand his patterns and motivations. Anderson had been active on multiple dating platforms. Investigators would later discover handwritten usernames and passwords for various dating sites in his home, suggesting a systematic approach to online dating that went beyond casual use. This wasn't someone looking for a genuine connection, this was someone treating dating apps like hunting grounds. The ease with which predators could access potential victims through these platforms was becoming a growing concern for law enforcement. Unlike traditional meeting places where people were somewhat known quantities, friends of friends, classmates, coworkers, dating apps provided access to complete strangers with minimal vetting or accountability. The exact details of how Saad first encountered Maxwell Anderson remain somewhat unclear, highlighting one of the challenges investigators face in the digital age. What we do know is that their initial contact likely occurred through online platforms, possibly dating apps, in the weeks leading up to April 1, 2024. Anderson worked at Victor's, a nightclub in Milwaukee, and some evidence suggests that he and Saad may have encountered each other there before their digital connection. One of Saada's co-workers mentioned that they had frequented the club, which creates the possibility that their online meeting wasn't entirely random, that Anderson may have noticed her in person before seeking her out digitally. This detail becomes more sinister when viewed through the lens of what investigators would later discover: Anderson had been planning something for at least a month before Saada's death. A confidential informant would eventually tell police that Anderson had expressed intentions to harm someone, suggesting that his pursuit of Saad wasn't romantic but predatory from the very beginning. The conversations between Saad and Anderson in the days leading up to their date followed what seemed like a normal pattern. They exchanged messages, got to know each other's interests, and eventually decided to meet in person. From Saada's perspective, this was likely exciting, the possibility of meeting someone new, perhaps starting something meaningful. Anderson was skilled at presenting himself as safe and trustworthy. He suggested meeting at the Twisted Fisherman, a legitimate restaurant in Milwaukee's Menominee Valley. This wasn't some isolated location or sketchy bar, it was a real establishment where people went for normal dates. The choice of venue would have seemed reassuring to Saad and anyone she told about her plans. The planning of their date followed conventional wisdom about safe meeting practices. They would meet at a public restaurant, somewhere Saad could feel comfortable and leave if she felt uncomfortable. Anderson played the part of a gentleman, someone who understood the importance of making a good first impression and ensuring his date felt safe. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, Anderson was preparing for something entirely different. Evidence would later suggest that he had been acquiring items and making preparations that had nothing to do with a romantic evening and everything to do with violence. While Saad was probably choosing what to wear and feeling the normal excitement and nerves that come with meeting someone new, Anderson was finalizing plans for her murder. The disconnect between these two realities, Saada's hopeful anticipation and Anderson's sinister preparation, represents one of the most disturbing aspects of this case. It shows how completely someone can be deceived, how normal interactions can mask deadly intentions, and how vulnerable we all are when we trust someone new. April 1, 2024, dawned like any other spring day in Milwaukee. For Saad Robinson, it probably began with the familiar butterflies that come with preparing for a first date. She would have gone through her usual routines, showering, choosing clothes, maybe texting friends about her evening plans. These mundane activities take on a heartbreaking poignancy when we know what would happen next. Saad drove her 2020 Honda Civic to meet Anderson at the Twisted Fisherman. This restaurant, located in Milwaukee's Menominee Valley, was a reasonable choice for a first date, public, well-lit, with enough activity to feel safe but intimate enough for conversation. The drive there would have given her time to think about what she hoped for from the evening, perhaps to calm any nerves or excitement she felt about meeting someone new. Surveillance footage would later capture the moment Saad met Anderson at the restaurant. These images, grainy and silent, represent the last normal moments of her life. In them, we see two people who appear to be having an ordinary interaction, a man and woman meeting for dinner, the kind of scene that plays out thousands of times every day across the country. The dinner itself proceeded without any apparent incident. Restaurant staff who would later be interviewed by police didn't notice anything unusual about the couple. They ordered food, talked, and behaved like any other first date in progress. Anderson was presumably charming, attentive, and engaging, exactly what he needed to be to keep Saad comfortable and unsuspecting. This ability to maintain a facade of normalcy even while planning violence speaks to Anderson's capacity for calculated deception. He wasn't someone who lost control in a moment of passion or rage. He was someone who could sit across from his intended victim, make conversation, and even pay for dinner while knowing exactly what he intended to do to her later. After dinner, the pair decided to continue their evening at Duke's on Water, another legitimate establishment in Milwaukee. This decision might have felt natural to Saad, the evening was going well, her date seemed nice, and extending their time together probably felt like a positive development. For Anderson, it was another step in his carefully orchestrated plan. Duke's on Water provided a different atmosphere than the restaurant, more casual, more conducive to relaxed conversation over drinks. Again, surveillance footage would capture their time there, showing what appeared to be a normal couple enjoying each other's company. Saad probably felt increasingly comfortable with Anderson, perhaps beginning to think that she had found someone worth getting to know better. The transition from public to private spaces is often a critical moment in these types of cases. As long as they remained in restaurants and bars, Saad was relatively safe. There were witnesses, security cameras, and the social constraints that keep most people's behavior within acceptable bounds. But Anderson was working toward getting her alone, away from these protections. Exactly how he convinced her to leave with him remains unclear, but it was probably easier than we might imagine. If the evening had gone well, if he had been charming and respectful, if she felt a connection, then suggesting they go somewhere more private might have seemed like a natural progression. Anderson knew how to make this suggestion seem romantic rather than dangerous. The last surveillance footage of Saad alive shows her leaving Dukes on water with Anderson. In these final images, she appears relaxed and happy, walking beside someone she believed she could trust. She had no way of knowing that she was walking toward her death, that the man beside her had been planning her murder for weeks. What happened after Saad and Anderson left Dukes on water would be reconstructed painstakingly by investigators through physical evidence, surveillance footage, and digital records. The story they uncovered was one of calculated violence that began almost immediately after the couple left the public eye. Anderson had prepared for this moment. Unlike crimes of passion that erupt suddenly, this was a methodical execution of a plan he had been developing for weeks. He had acquired the tools he would need, identified locations where he could carry out his intentions, and created a timeline that he believed would allow him to escape detection. The first indication that Saad was in immediate danger came from her own behavior, or rather, the sudden cessation of it. She was someone who stayed connected with friends and family, who responded to texts and maintained her social media presence. When this communication stopped abruptly after she left the bar with Anderson, it created the first red flag that something was wrong. Meanwhile, Anderson was putting his plan into action. The murder itself, while central to understanding this case, was so brutal that investigators struggled to piece together exactly what happened. What they could determine was that Anderson killed Saad sometime in the early hours of April 2, shortly after their date ended. The location of the murder remained a subject of investigation. Evidence suggested it didn't occur at Anderson's residence, despite extensive searches that uncovered disturbing items including multiple knives, ammunition, and handgun cases. This meant Anderson had either committed the crime elsewhere or had been extremely thorough in cleaning up afterward. After killing Saad, Anderson began the process of dismembering her body, an act that requires not just violence but a complete dehumanization of the victim. This wasn't something done in a moment of panic or rage, it was methodical, planned, and executed with chilling precision. The fact that he was prepared to carry out this aspect of his plan suggests he had thought through every step of what he intended to do. While Anderson was dismembering Saada's body, her absence was already being noticed. She was scheduled to work at the pizza restaurant on April 2, and when she didn't show up for her shift, her coworkers immediately knew something was wrong. This wasn't like her, she was reliable, responsible, and would have called if she couldn't make it to work. The concern from her coworkers represents something beautiful in this dark story. Saad was genuinely cared for by the people in her life. She had built real relationships, created connections that meant something to others. When she disappeared, people noticed immediately, not because they were suspicious or paranoid, but because they knew her well enough to recognize that her behavior was completely out of character. The first sign that something terrible had happened to Saad Robinson came on April 2, but not from her failure to show up for work. Instead, it came from a horrific discovery along the shores of Lake Michigan. A passerby walking along the beach found what appeared to be a human leg, a discovery that would launch one of Milwaukee's most intensive homicide investigations. The discovery of human remains along Lake Michigan's shoreline wasn't unprecedented, but it was always treated with the utmost seriousness by law enforcement. The Milwaukee County Medical Examiner's Office was called in, along with investigators from multiple jurisdictions, to process the scene and determine what they were dealing with. Initial examination of the remains raised immediate concerns. This wasn't someone who had died of natural causes or even a typical homicide. The condition of the remains suggested dismemberment, which indicated either extreme violence or an attempt to dispose of evidence, or both. This discovery transformed what might have been a missing person case into a homicide investigation. While investigators were processing the scene at Lake Michigan, Sada's co-workers and friends were becoming increasingly worried about her absence. They had tried calling and texting her throughout the day without response, which was completely unlike her. The combination of her uncharacteristic absence from work and lack of communication created a growing sense that something was seriously wrong. The process of identifying the remains found at the lake would take time, but investigators were already working with the assumption that they were dealing with a homicide. The location where the remains were found, the condition they were in, and the apparent attempt to dispose of them all pointed to someone who had killed another person and was trying to avoid detection. On the same day the leg was discovered, another crucial piece of evidence emerged. Sada's car was found burned in an alley near 29th and Lisbon Avenue in Milwaukee. The 2020 Honda Civic was completely destroyed by fire, but investigators could still identify it through the vehicle identification number and other forensic markers. The discovery of the burned car provided investigators with their first major lead. Cars don't burn themselves, and the location where it was found wasn't random. Someone had driven Sada's car to that specific location and set it on fire, presumably to destroy evidence of whatever had happened to her. Surveillance footage from the area around where the car was found would prove crucial to the investigation. Cameras captured an unidentifiable individual driving the Honda Civic in the early hours of April 2, moving slowly through the streets before pulling into the alley where it would later be found burned. The footage showed someone who knew exactly what they were doing, someone who had planned this disposal of evidence. The timeline was becoming clear. Saad had gone on her date the evening of April 1, disappeared sometime in the early hours of April 2, and by dawn of that same day, someone was driving her car around Milwaukee before ultimately destroying it. This suggested that whatever had happened to her had occurred very quickly after she left the bar with Anderson. With human remains found at Lake Michigan and Sada's burned car discovered in Milwaukee, investigators faced the complex task of connecting these physical pieces of evidence to determine what had happened and who was responsible. The Milwaukee Police Department launched a full-scale homicide investigation, bringing together detectives, forensic specialists, and support personnel for what they knew would be a challenging case. The first priority was confirming the identity of the remains found at the lake. While the discovery of the burned car strongly suggested they belonged to Saad Robinson, investigators needed definitive identification through DNA analysis or other forensic methods. This process, while scientifically straightforward, takes time during which a killer might be destroying additional evidence or preparing to flee. Simultaneously, investigators began reconstructing Sada's final evening. They gathered surveillance footage from the Twisted Fisherman and Dukes on Water, interviewed staff members who had worked on April 1, and began building a timeline of her movements. This painstaking work revealed that she had indeed been with Maxwell Anderson throughout the evening, making him the last known person to see her alive. Anderson quickly became the focus of the investigation, but being the last person to see someone alive doesn't automatically make someone a suspect. Investigators needed evidence, and gathering that evidence required search warrants, forensic analysis, and careful documentation of everything they found. The first search warrant was executed on Anderson's residence, a process that would yield disturbing discoveries. Investigators found handwritten usernames and passwords for multiple dating websites in a folder labeled Dating, suggesting a systematic approach to online dating that went beyond casual use. They also discovered 5 knives throughout the house, along with a handgun case and ammunition. Perhaps most disturbing was what investigators found in Anderson's car. A detective noted what appeared to be blood in plain sight on the front passenger door, along with other potential evidence that would need forensic analysis to determine its significance. This discovery suggested that Anderson's vehicle had been used in the commission of the crime. The search of Anderson's digital devices revealed additional concerning information. His internet history, social media accounts, and communication records painted a picture of someone who had been actively seeking victims through online platforms. The systematic nature of his approach suggested that Saad might not have been his first target, raising questions about whether there were other victims who hadn't been discovered. As investigators dug deeper into Anderson's background, they discovered that he worked at Victor's nightclub, a venue that Saad and her co-workers had reportedly frequented. This connection raised the possibility that Anderson had noticed Saad in person before seeking her out through online platforms, adding a layer of premeditation to his actions. The forensic analysis of the remains found at Lake Michigan confirmed what investigators feared: they belonged to Saad Robinson. DNA analysis provided definitive identification, transforming the case from a missing person investigation into a confirmed homicide. This confirmation also meant that investigators were now looking for additional remains, as the discovery of a single body part suggested that Saada's body had been dismembered and possibly scattered across multiple locations. The confirmation that the remains found at Lake Michigan belonged to Saad Robinson prompted an intensive search effort along the shoreline and in other areas where additional body parts might have been disposed of. This was grim work that required investigators to consider where someone intent on disposing of evidence might go, while also accounting for how currents, weather, and wildlife might affect the distribution of remains. The search efforts proved tragically successful. Over the course of several days, additional remains were discovered at various locations around Milwaukee County. Each discovery was processed as a separate crime scene, with forensic teams documenting the location, condition, and any associated evidence before carefully recovering the remains for examination. On April 18, a passerby walking along another section of Lake Michigan Beach made another horrific discovery: a torso and arm that would later be confirmed through testing to belong to Saad. This discovery, like the first, was made by an ordinary person going about their daily routine who stumbled upon evidence of an extraordinary crime. The pattern of these discoveries told investigators several important things about the perpetrator. First, the person responsible had access to transportation and was familiar enough with the Milwaukee area to know where remains might be disposed of without immediate discovery. Second, they had taken time to attempt to distribute the remains across multiple locations, suggesting an awareness of how difficult this would make identification and investigation. The dismemberment and disposal of Saada's remains represented a level of violence and dehumanization that shocked even experienced investigators. This wasn't someone who had killed in a moment of passion and then panicked about disposal. This was someone who had planned not just the murder but the aftermath, someone who was prepared to treat another human being as disposable evidence to be scattered and hidden. Each new discovery brought additional forensic evidence but also additional trauma for Saada's family and friends. They were being forced to confront not just the reality that she was dead, but the horrific nature of what had been done to her. The scattered discoveries meant that her loved ones couldn't even have the closure of a complete recovery of her remains. The forensic examination of the recovered remains provided investigators with crucial information about how Saad had died and what had been done to her afterward. While the specific details were too disturbing and graphic to be released to the public, they confirmed that this was a case of extreme violence followed by methodical dismemberment. The tools used in the dismemberment became a focus of the investigation. The precision and completeness of the dismemberment suggested that Anderson had access to appropriate tools and had either planned this aspect of the crime in advance or had experience with this type of activity. The knives found in his residence during the search warrant were examined for evidence, though investigators believed the actual dismemberment had occurred elsewhere. The psychological profile of someone capable of this level of violence was deeply disturbing. This wasn't just someone who could kill, this was someone who could continue to inflict violence on a victim after death, someone who could treat a human being as nothing more than a problem to be solved through disposal and concealment. With physical evidence mounting and the investigation focusing on Maxwell Anderson, prosecutors began the complex process of building a case that would hold up in court. This required not just proving that Anderson had killed Saad Robinson, but demonstrating the premeditation that would support charges of first-degree intentional homicide. The timeline investigators had constructed painted a clear picture of Anderson's actions on April 1st and 2nd, but they needed more than just circumstantial evidence. They needed forensic proof, witness testimony, and documentation that would convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt that Anderson was responsible for Saada's death and the subsequent cover-up. The forensic analysis of Anderson's vehicle proved crucial to building this case. The blood found on the passenger door was tested and, surprisingly, determined not to be Saada's. This discovery raised questions about other potential victims or incidents, suggesting that Anderson's violent behavior might have been more extensive than initially suspected. The source of this blood remains unknown, adding another disturbing dimension to the case. Digital evidence played a significant role in establishing Anderson's guilt. Cell phone records, GPS data, and surveillance footage created a comprehensive picture of his movements in the hours after Sada's disappearance. This electronic trail showed Anderson in locations consistent with the disposal of remains and the burning of Sada's car, providing objective evidence of his involvement in the cover-up. The discovery of Anderson's systematic approach to online dating became another key element of the prosecution's case. The handwritten usernames and passwords for multiple dating sites suggested someone who was actively hunting for victims, not someone looking for genuine romantic connections. This evidence supported the theory that Anderson had specifically targeted Saad, rather than killing her in a moment of uncontrolled violence. Perhaps most damaging to Anderson's case was the testimony from a confidential informant who came forward to law enforcement. This individual, described as a friend of Anderson's, told investigators that Anderson had expressed intentions to harm someone approximately 1 month before Sada's murder. This testimony provided direct evidence of premeditation, transforming the case from one of possible second-degree murder to clear first-degree intentional homicide. The confidential informant's cooperation with law enforcement represented a crucial break in the case. Without this testimony, prosecutors might have struggled to prove premeditation beyond the circumstantial evidence of Anderson's preparations and the methodical nature of the crime. With it, they had direct evidence that Anderson had been planning to kill someone well before he ever met Saad. The charges filed against Anderson reflected the severity and complexity of his crimes: first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, hiding a corpse, and arson. Each charge addressed a different aspect of his criminal behavior, from the initial murder through the attempted cover-up and disposal of evidence. The decision to charge Anderson with mutilating a corpse was particularly significant, as it acknowledged the additional trauma and horror he had inflicted on Sada's remains after her death. This charge recognized that Anderson's crimes went beyond the killing itself to include acts that violated basic human dignity and complicated the investigation and grieving process for Sada's loved ones. Maxwell Anderson's trial began in 2025, more than a year after Saad Robinson's murder. The delay, while frustrating for those seeking justice, allowed investigators and prosecutors time to build the most comprehensive case possible. The evidence they presented painted a devastating picture of premeditated murder followed by calculated attempts to avoid detection. The prosecution's case was methodical and thorough, presenting evidence that traced Anderson's actions from his initial targeting of Saad through online platforms to the disposal of her remains and destruction of her vehicle. They showed the jury surveillance footage of Sada's final evening, forensic evidence from the crime scenes, and testimony from the confidential informant about Anderson's stated intentions. The defense faced an almost impossible task. The physical evidence against Anderson was overwhelming, the timeline of his actions was well documented, and the premeditation was clear from multiple sources. They were defending someone who had not only committed murder but had done so in a particularly brutal and calculated manner. Throughout the trial, Sada's family and friends had to relive the horror of her death through testimony and evidence presentation. They showed remarkable strength in attending the proceedings, ensuring that Saad was remembered not just as a victim but as a person who had been loved and whose life had meaning beyond her tragic end. The jury's deliberation was relatively brief, considering the complexity of the case. The evidence against Anderson was simply too overwhelming to ignore or explain away. On June 6, 2025, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts: first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, hiding a corpse, and arson. The conviction brought a measure of justice for Saad Robinson, but it couldn't undo the horror of what had happened to her or restore her to the people who loved her. It did, however, ensure that Anderson would face the full consequences of his actions and would never have the opportunity to harm another person in the same way. For jurors who found Anderson guilty later spoke about the experience, describing the evidence as overwhelming but noting the heavy mental toll that serving on such a case had taken. Their service represents one of the often overlooked aspects of seeking justice for victims of violent crime, the emotional cost borne by everyone involved in the process. The murder of Saad Robinson represents more than just another tragic crime story. It highlights the vulnerabilities inherent in modern dating, the predatory behavior that can hide behind seemingly normal interactions, and the importance of taking missing persons cases seriously from the very beginning. Saada's case became a catalyst for discussions about dating safety, particularly for young women navigating online platforms. It demonstrated how someone with malicious intent could exploit these systems to identify and target victims, using the very tools designed to help people connect to instead cause harm. The investigation also highlighted the importance of thorough police work and the value of treating every missing person case with urgency and seriousness. The quick response from law enforcement, combined with meticulous forensic work and investigation, ensured that Anderson was held accountable for his crimes. Perhaps most importantly, Saada's story reminds us that behind every true crime case is a real person whose life had value and meaning. She wasn't just a victim, she was a daughter, friend, co-worker, and community member whose absence created a void in the lives of those who knew her. The case has contributed to ongoing conversations about how to make dating safer in the digital age, how to better protect potential victims, and how to identify and stop predators before they can act on their violent intentions. While we cannot change what happened to Saad, we can work to prevent similar tragedies from occurring to others. As we conclude this story, we remember Saad Robinson not for how she died, but for how she lived, as a young woman full of potential whose life was cut short by senseless violence. Her memory serves as both a tribute to her life and a reminder of the work we all must do to create a safer world for everyone. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.